without him, so he'll get here, I think, very soon. But in the interest of time and time economy, we'll go ahead and get started. First up, I want to thank the members who are here as members of the Joint Committee on Georgia Criminal Justice Reform. Under the category of, because you don't have enough to do already, you're assigned to this committee, and I appreciate your willingness to go ahead and take the time to be here on this very important issue. And the first thing I want to say, and I'll say as little as possible at the outset, and we'll get our first guest up here to the witness table, is we wouldn't be here but for the leadership of our governor, Nathan Deal. That is a fact, and that resonated with me very early when I was sitting there in the House chamber, and I think it was about the second or third sentence in his first State of the State address had to do with criminal justice reform. That was a very big hint to me that this was an issue that was foremost in the governor's mind. And the truth of the matter is, we wouldn't be here today moving toward forging a consensus on how we're going to have a smarter judicial system, a criminal justice system, that is, but for the leadership of Governor Deal. And that's just a fact that I believe, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. The bill that was dropped in, House Bill 1176, is and I've said this yesterday, I'll state it again today, it is a starting point. The special counsel that was created through the leadership of the legislation of Chairman Jay Neal last session, I think it was House Bill 265, created the council, and the council met over the balance of last year, produced their report late last year for our consideration. And it offered the General Assembly really a wide variety of options and recommendations on alternatives, on what we could do to have a smarter system that allocated and used taxpayer resources in a more efficient manner while not making sacrifices in that highest of priorities, which of course is public safety. And our ability to go ahead and take those recommendations and balance those against our concerns and, of course, the views of our constituents as it relates to public safety, that balancing exercise is why we're here. And I'm fully confident that we'll get to the point where we strike in a truly outstanding balance and move the ball forward on criminal justice reform. From a logistics standpoint, today we're going to go from 10 to 12. This is with agreement of Chairman Hamrick. We're going to go from 10 to 12, break for lunch between 12 and 1, and then come back from 1 to 3. My sense is that we'll stretch into tomorrow morning. We'll do everything we can to limit ourselves to 9 to noon tomorrow, given the fact that it's Friday, and I know there are folks here not from the Atlanta metro area who want to go ahead and get home before traffic kicks in. We understand that. And then we'll just extend from there. This morning, the plan is to, and in respect to these individual schedules, Director Vernon Keenan from the GBI is here. We welcome him, and he'll be our first witness. He'll be followed by Judge Mike Boggs, who is a newly minted, as you know, Court of Appeals judge, recently appointed and sworn in. But for purposes of our joint committee here today, was previously a Superior Court judge in Waycross, and more to the point, ran a drug court. He's here with Superior Court Judge Jeff Bagley, I believe, and they'll be coming up together to talk about and to answer questions regarding their experiences in running a drug court, what works, what doesn't work, what they've seen, and really just to answer questions and for us to draw upon them as a resource, because they are an outstanding resource, as of course is the director. My sense is that will go toward 11:30-ish, 11:45-ish or so, and then depending on the time we'll break. And then Pat Head, who is my district attorney in Cobb County, has served as a defense lawyer, as solicitor, district attorney, and also serves as chair of the State Bar's Committee on Criminal Justice Reform, if I'm not mistaken. So Mr. Head is wearing various hats as it relates to this issue, and I think because of that, can offer a very good perspective, both from the bar perspective and drawing upon his personal experience as a prosecutor and a defense lawyer. From then, we'll march on from there. We'll see how that goes. That's a plan, and we're just going to try to keep to a plan as best we can, and then go on from there. So with that, let me ask Director Keenan, and if he'd like to bring any member of his staff, he's certainly welcome to do so. And to members of the Joint Committee, I don't foresee this as being a very formal exercise. I think we do better if it's more of a dialogue. I'm going to go ahead and just open up with a question of Director Keenan. I don't have any expectation that Director Keenan has spent all of his free time reading House Bill 1176. That would be an unreasonable expectation. But part of the reason why we're here, in my mind, which I don't seek to impose on anyone, is to, and with the aspects of the bill that are in there as opposed to not in there, one of the primary considerations that we have on this side of the table is the practical effect of anything that we do. I say this in the committee that I'm privileged to chair. I see words on paper. I see recommendations from various outlets. They could be professional. They could be academic. They could be from think tanks, wherever. And they make a lot of sense in conversation. But then we put the words on paper, and one of the first questions that I ask, and I know that we ask, is, tell me how this actually will play out. Tell me how this will actually play out in the real world in terms of operations, ongoing management, adequate funding, all the due diligence questions that I think we have a responsibility to ask as we consider a piece of consensus legislation. So one of the, and I'll get right to it, Director, in the interest of time, one part of the bill has to do with, of course, how we treat drug offenses and how we will prosecute those, the sentencing ranges as it relates to those, and how we treat them on a case-by-case basis. A subject that's gotten a lot of conversation, of course, is going to what's called the weight-based approach, 0 to 1 gram, 1 to 2 grams, 1 to 4 grams, 4 to 28 grams, etc. Really, the only question that I have, and I know your response may create more questions from the committee, which is obviously welcome, is I'm only concerned that I've got, and it's in the bill right now, is how that approach will have an effect on the GBI's ability to carry out its mission on a day-to-day basis. And obviously what I'm talking about is the crime lab. How will it affect the workload of the crime lab? What do you foresee will be the challenges, if any, if we go ahead and adopt that approach? What will you need or not need going forward? And our job is not to make your job harder. It's to go ahead and set forth policy, but also to give you the resources to do that job, or else it's just an unfunded mandate, right? So if you could speak to that in any way you see fit, we'd be grateful.
Thank you. And I have with me this morning Assistant Director Dan Kirk, who is the former director of the GBI Crime Laboratory. And by way of answering your question, I'd like to lay a foundation for the GBI Crime Laboratory. We are the only crime laboratory in the state of Georgia. If there is a drug case which is to be prosecuted in the courts of this state, then those drugs have been analyzed at the GBI Crime Laboratory. On an average, we do 25,000 drug cases a year, and the way that the lab operates, and because we're at marginal staffing, anytime we make a change in the operation of the crime lab, it requires a adjustment within the way we do day-to-day business. Many times that will have an adverse impact on our ability to handle the cases which are coming in the door. So when there's a piece of legislation that comes up that's going to require additional work for the crime laboratory, which this legislation will, then it's going to have an impact on our ability to turn out the cases that we are doing now. We had worked with the commission previously, back in when they began their work, looking at the issue of sentencing based around tiered sentencing based around the weight of the drugs, and all the work that we had done had been looking at an area of dealing with two drugs, which are the two the most prominent drugs in Georgia, cocaine and methamphetamine. By the way, the top three abused drugs in Georgia are cocaine, methamphetamine, prescription drugs, in that order. But we had looked at the effect of tiered sentencing based by weight, looking at one weight. and the cost associated with doing just cocaine and methamphetamine in one weight was $1.3 million. And this is based on it would require 8 to 10 additional scientists to take on this new type of testing, because currently we're looking at a threshold of 28 grams. And if it's less than 28 grams, then we do the test on one part of that evidence. Over 28 grams, we got to establish the weight in the type drug, of course. When we add additional weight measurements, weight testing in there, then it creates additional work. That's where the other costs would come in. So we did the research on this to come up with the $1.3 million cost to do this. Work with the governor's staff, understanding and supporting the governor's position that yes, it will to go to the weight sentencing of cocaine and methamphetamine would cost $1.3 million on the front end, but the outcome would be a cost savings to the state by persons not going to prison who only have a small amount of methamphetamine. So we understood that and support that, provided we get the resources which we were assured would come to us to do this. The bill which is before us now expands out beyond cocaine and methamphetamine and goes to all drugs. Our staff met last night, the crime lab staff, looking at this. They can't calculate the exact figure, and I've learned that when I'm dealing with scientists, they don't talk off the top of their heads. They go A to Z and dot every I and cross the T's. But they're conservatively, we're looking at $5 million if we go with this current bill. This would be additional scientists which would be required to come into the agency to turn out the workload. If we do not get the additional resources, and the law changes, and we don't get additional resources, what will happen is that the crime lab in the drug identification section, those 25,000 cases are going to come basically to a standstill. We'll be doing only exigent cases that are absolutely required by a prosecutor, and everything else will sit in a backlog. So it's going to require resources. That's my answer.
Thank you. Is the $5 million you're talking? Is that? I assume that's largely for personnel.
Staff and equipment, but the great cost would be for continuing staff. We'll have to have some equipment up front because of the nature of the analysis. But the staffing, and this is be a recurring cost because it's not just one time the scientists work for a year and then they go away.
Right. So sure.
That's also provided we can hire all these scientists based on the salaries that we're paying them currently.
What would you estimate your backlog to be now, generally, if you can even speak in those terms?
We speak currently. We average around 5,000 cases in the backlog, and the backlog those are cases that are over 45 days old. And when I talked about we operate at marginal staffing, when we discuss backlog, it's important to understand that when we hire a new scientist, it takes them 12 to 18 months to be trained. Well, when they're being trained, they're not working cases, nor is the scientist who is training them. So the backlog will increase. Currently, the backlog is decreasing. Last month, we dropped 1,000 cases out of the backlog that got worked. Why did that occur? Scientists completed their training. They go out they're in the bench now. They're behind the microscope. They're working the cases. The backlog comes down. We'll have scientists that will leave us to go to other jobs because they make more money, and then we're back in the cycle again. It'll climb back up. Our turnover rate is 10%.
I'll ask one other follow-up, and then I'll go ahead and yield to members of the committee. My secondhand understanding is that if you're going to a system of this weight-based system, a lot of times what I've heard, and just from the conversations that occur in this building and the building across the street, with regard to drug prosecutions, a lot of times you're talking about not necessarily one bag of 28 grams or 30 grams or whatever it may be. You're talking about multiple bags of whatever it is. And of course that's a case-by-case situation, is it the type of thing where if you have those multiples under this system, does that add to the burden in and of itself?
You've outlined the problem, which is very succinctly, which is the reason why I brought a prop.
Okay.
If this was one bag of methamphetamine,
Mm-hmm.
it's all one bag, we would test the bag, we would weigh it. Simple matter. That's not what comes into the crime lab, generally. What comes into the crime lab is a bag like this, which is consisting of multiple pieces of drugs in smaller bags or pills or crack cocaine or whatever. It's not one substance, it's multiple substances. So when we go into testing for weight, whereas now we're testing this to determine what it is and weighing it. If it's over 28 grams, then we know it's a trafficking case. If it's less, it's a possession case. But when we get into the weight best, the weighing it for sentencing purposes, now instead of testing the one drug, we've got to test how many's in here to determine what it is and what the weight is, because the amount of weight of this is going to determine the sentence.
When you answered the question earlier, thank you for the response and for clarifying that for me in my own mind. When you answered before about the additional, under this approach, the additional $5 million that you would need, I assume that $5 million contemplates the additional testing that would occur in terms of having to weigh those additional units of drugs, whatever you want to call it.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so that doesn't, that figure, which I realize is not a hard figure, but
Right.
it's as hard as you can get right now, it contemplates that additional workload.
That is correct. That is
caused by the weight.
Yes,
okay.
sir. That is based on what the crime lab scientist staff are looking at, generally looking at all the drugs now coming in. Now, instead of just dealing with methamphetamine and cocaine, we're going to expand out to these other drugs, which is all this additional work. That's correct.
Mr. Willard, is that you?
It is. I just want to point out, you asked part of the question, what I want to ask of Mr. Keenan. Excuse me. If you have scientists, does it take the same level criteria of training, expertise of a person who is a scientist to do the weighing, or can you have someone who may be of a less higher level?
It has to be the scientist. That's part of the process.
Because one person go testify as opposed to two.
Yeah. It's not actually the weighing of it. I mean, the weighing is not the issue. It's the testing enough of the material to gain the weight that's necessary to meet the sentencing guideline.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have.
And not to truly not to oversimplify it, but provided the funding is there, just from an operational standpoint, it's something that the GBI is confident it could execute in terms of its core mission. Is that a fair statement?
With resources, yes, we can do the work and continue to do quality work, but we wouldn't be able to just have the funding come in and then immediately go into doing this type of work.
Right.
Our staff estimates it take about a year to build up to get all the processes in place with the various drugs to do what the intent of the bill would be.
Senator Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, I just wanted to clarify what I think you're saying, but I just wanted to make sure that we are understanding this. This $5 million that they're conservatively estimating, that's not just a one-time cost to get it started. That's going to be an ongoing cost year after year to be able to handle the quantity of cases that you're anticipating.
That's correct. It would be, the vast majority of that is for salaries for new scientists to do the work.
Okay.
Mr. Weldon.
Thank you.
Mine's off. It's supposed to be on.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Keenan, thank you for being here. I appreciate your input. It's my understanding that as a result of attrition in your with your scientists, it's been really difficult for you guys to be able to provide scientists there to testify in drug cases. And the way our system works is if somebody makes a demand for speedy trial, then they've got 2 terms of court to get there, or else that case is out as a matter of law. With this, can you just comment on how the way the code's written now would impact your ability to provide witnesses within that demand for speedy trial time frame.
Yes, sir. Here's what happens when the scientist who works the case, if they leave the agency, and here again our turnover rate is 10%. That case is called up for court. The scientist is not going to be available because they're no longer in state employment. Sometimes we get them back. We don't even try to do that. What we do is rework the case.
That's all you can.
So we're doubling up the work based on turnover rate with scientists.
If I could follow up with one question. So if you got the $5 million here and we're able to hire the scientists you need to have in order to handle the work, does that also contemplate them going and testifying in a court of law?
Yes, sir. It wouldn't change unless we raise the salaries of the agents. All we're doing, we're adding new scientists to do this additional work, but the turnover rate doesn't get addressed. Got more scientists to leave us.
Director, let me ask you to pull the mic a little bit closer. The mic, if you could pull that a little bit closer to you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. No.
And so it really may not help very much. Because if you still have that same attrition, but you still have.
Yes, sir. That's correct.
Thank you.
Senator Jeffries. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I saw your light there. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Representative Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just interested. What do you estimate is the disparity between what you all pay and what the scientists are leaving for in salary?
It's almost double. The pay of our scientists compared to what they make when they go to work for the federal government or go into private business is roughly 40 to 50% more, and they do less work in these other agencies. Our scientists work very, very hard. We have very high demands for them, so they earn more. They earn every bit the state pays them and deserves more. The number one priority for the crime lab, as Vernon Keenan sees it, is additional salaries for our agents. I'd love to have more. I mean, scientists and agents, but scientists, we need more scientists. But the critical part is to stop the turnover rate, because we'll never get ahead of the backlog no matter what happened.
Any further questions from members of the committee? Seeing none, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. That was very helpful.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me bend over the salaries.
Thank you. Let me ask Judge Boggs and Judge Bagley if they'd come forward. And as they're coming to sit down, let me just preface for members of the committee to go ahead and make sure that our friends in the judiciary are covered appropriately. We don't want to put the judges in an awkward position with regard to making recommendations on policy. Really, what they're here for is for us to draw upon their wealth of experience, especially as it relates to drug courts, best practices, what works, what doesn't work. There may be references and questions as it relates to some parts of the bill as it's written right now. That's not asking either Judge Bagley or Judge Boggs to say, yes, that's a good idea, pass it. No, that's a bad idea, don't pass it, from an advocacy standpoint. But by the same token, we don't want to chill getting their perspective and, again, the benefit of their experience. I'll go ahead and open it up, and this is a conversation that Chairman Neal and I had yesterday in a meeting that we had with members, and we both shared the same experience as we walked into this issue. Chairman Neal had the benefit of being on the council, if I recall. No, did not. Okay, but has a wealth of experience that I don't. Others on the joint committee were members of the council. I was not. But if you had just looked at me and said, who's the person that's most likely to go ahead and benefit by a drug court program as I've come to understand it, and I don't fully understand it, which is, again, part of the reason why you're here, and we're learning as we go, I would have said, well, of course, it's your, 20, 21, 22-year-old young person, little bit of a criminal history, but they're on sort of the edge. You go ahead and put them in a drug court program and just nip it in the bud, right? And in fact, what I've learned through conversations with people who have experience with it, including Judge Boggs, is in fact that's not true, and that really we do better to direct the individuals who are perhaps more of a medium to higher risk individual into that type of program. That's not a uniform statement. That's, everything's case by case. But from a breadth of experience standpoint, that's what I think I've come to learn, subject to being educated otherwise by those who actually do know, meaning you. If you could, either one of you, just talk to your experiences about that, that will inevitably create questions from the committee. I'm also interested in how, from one of the questions that's come up with regard to the legislation and just in general is, of course, the sentencing range from as it relates to these drug offenses. And I think there's an ability to come to a consensus on that. Speaking for myself personally and from what was introduced, I just want something that works, something that's realistic. Whether that's the bill that's introduced, great. If it's not the bill that's introduced, that's great too. What we need to hear from you is, what's the range of time that you need? What I've heard and what I have come to understand is that you need at least 2 years for a drug, on a sentence in order for a drug court participant to potentially succeed, in order to allow for time for them to fall off the wagon and get back on, and all the supervision that goes along with that. If you could speak to that, not from a here's what you should pass standpoint, but just from a here's what we've experienced standpoint, the average time generally, I know we would really benefit by that. So,
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. Interestingly, Judge Bagley and I, Judge Bagley currently runs a drug court program that's a pre-adjudication drug court program. In my former life as a Superior Court judge, I ran a post-adjudication drug court program, and I'm happy to explain the differences and talk about the nuances as between the two. But philosophically, drug court programs were kind of born out of a recognition that drugs were driving a vast majority of the felony criminal cases, at least in my 6-county circuit, and I'm sure in Judge Bagley's, and I think statewide. In my circuit, in 6 counties in southeast Georgia, my former circuit, 85% of the felony criminal docket was driven by drug offenses. And traditionally, those would be easily recognizable as possession cases that are listed in the police report. But not so interestingly, and really outside the norm of average citizens' knowledge, most of the forgeries and the theft by takings and the theft by receivings and the financial transaction card fraud cases were also drug-related, in that traditionally they were being committed by people whose drug addiction was driving the offense. So I think drug courts were born out of a recognition that if we could find a way nationally to address the addiction issue that is driving the criminal conduct, which is ultimately driving the cost to have to incarcerate and address those through the criminal justice system, we'd probably be better off. And so born out of that came accountability courts, drug courts, mental health courts, DUI courts, and all of those traditional types of courts. Intuitively, you would think, and I did when I started my drug court program, that if we could nip the problem earlier rather than later, it would not only be fiscally responsible, but it would be morally responsible. We could save some lives of these young people that were getting involved in the drugs that Mr. Keenan, Director Keenan, and the GBI and your local law enforcement agencies see day in and day out. And interestingly, I built my program originally around the concept that we would try to address first offenders, and we would get those 20 and 21 and 22-year-old young girls that are doing pills for the first time, and we would find those folks that were doing cocaine for the first time, such that their use of those drugs was now interacting with the judicial system. I learned quite quickly that many of those people simply are not ready for a drug treatment program. And you talk to parents of kids, and they'll tell you, and if you have children that age, intuitively it seemed like a great idea, but what I found through my years of experience in running a drug court program was traditionally our best success was with people who had more substantial criminal histories, who were older, who in many instances on a risk assessment tool may have graded out as a moderate risk offender or even a high risk offender, I found that they were more willing and ready and had reached a point in their life that they were willing to do the things that were necessary to address their addiction. And interestingly, when I started recognizing that and asking others in this state that ran drug courts what were their personal experiences, they all had similar experiences. And interestingly, when I surveyed it further, I realized that nationally, now on national averages, your age of your successful graduates is traditionally older than that intuitive group that you would think could be helped. And so, one of the things that I think the council focused on, and that's hope will be important for this committee to focus on, is that sometimes intuition will lead you to the wrong conclusion. And when you think of accountability courts, drug courts particularly, either pre or post adjudication, your biggest bang for your buck is going to be to address the people that are most successful in these programs. And interestingly, they are going to be older, and traditionally that means that they may have more significant criminal histories. We don't yet do risk of needs assessments on each of these folks that come into drug court as a threshold entry to determine their eligibility. It's being proposed in this bill that we do that, and I think necessarily that's probably a good idea. I think the real rub's going to be, drug courts are a collaborative effort. They are collaborative with your district attorney and your public defender. It is a really unique way to address judicial resources, and it works. But it only works if you have on board your district attorney, your public defender, all your skill sets represented, including your treatment service providers and your probation. And so, while the judge is ultimately the gatekeeper of who does get in and who may not get in the program, I think it's very important that we be deferential to your DAs and you be deferential to the public defenders. Drug court programs, first and foremost, are voluntary. You cannot force somebody under current law into a drug court program lawfully. Judge Bagley's program and my program are voluntary programs. The participant has to agree to come into the program and then to agree to comply with all the terms and requirements of the program, which are onerous and, quite frankly, more onerous than that individual would typically receive had they gone through the regular disposition of their case in the judicial process. And so, I think that the challenge for you, the challenge for the council that I served on, was how do we figure out a way to put more of these modern high-risk offenders into the program and ultimately serve the people that are going to be best be served. In saying that, I think it's important that we not tie the hands of judges, however, and we give judges the discretion and the ability in their particular jurisdictions to take in people that may not fit the model of who succeeds always in drug court or traditionally in drug court, but give some flexibility. So, when I look at, for example, in your bill, Section 1.1 that deals with drug and mental health courts, and specifically page 3, you're tracking the language that we included in our recommendation number 1, which was that we develop an electronic information system for performance measures, that the Judicial Council promulgate and publish standards. We condition that, you all condition the award of state funding on compliance with those standards. We create a statewide certification and review process, and we expand funding for accountability courts, and I applaud the governor for his commitment to do that. And I think those are all very laudable goals. The details of how we actually physically put that into a bill or you do that and it be approved is certainly a policy decision that you're going to have to decide. But please understand that the drug court programs work. And they don't work just because I say they work. They work because the data nationally from the National Drug Court Institution all suggest that nationwide they reduce recidivism. They do so at a much more fiscally responsible cost to your taxpayers, and they reduce crime. They are not for everybody. They are but one alternative that your committee ought to consider in providing options for sentencing judges. But, Mr. Chairman, in short response to your question, intuitively, you may think that drug courts would work best for juveniles and work best for folks that get into the misdemeanor level and try to nip this criminal conduct early. And really, it's tough to do that based on physiology, how the brain chemistry works, how these addictions work within the brain chemistry. And then finally, I'll conclude with the time period within which an individual needs to be in one of these programs. I think traditionally, nationwide, it is suggested that if you develop one of these programs, it needs to be an 18 to 24-month program. And that's not that's not born out of just an arbitrary thought that that's long enough, but rather born out of some medical science and physiology that addresses how long it takes to fix someone's dependency on cocaine or methamphetamine, for example. And it's very complicated, but my program in South Georgia was a 24-month program. It's hard to get out in 24 months, but that's the structure of the program. I'm happy to answer questions about how a drug court program works from a post-adjudication standpoint, and I'm sure Judge Bagley can educate you on pre-adjudication programs. They are one tool. I don't want anybody to misunderstand that they're not necessarily going to work for everybody. There will be some failures. But traditionally, they'll reduce your recidivism rate in Georgia from what it is now, which is upward, up past 60%. That means, of those folks getting out of prison this year, which are a significant number, many of them will be reoffended and be sent back to prison within 3 years. The recidivism rate for folks that are completing a drug court program pre or post adjudication can get down to about 10%. And you can treat that individual in a drug court program for roughly $5,000 a year as opposed to $18,000 a year in prison. And you've addressed really the core problem that's driving their conduct and driving, in many instances, our growing prison population.
Those are exactly the people we need to keep out of the prison population. Yeah. I mean, that's where the rubber hits the road, as I see it, in terms of the cost savings, and in terms of the where rehabilitation is possible. And I think that's what this is all coming down to. Just making sure that system works.
It's not really a soft on crime approach. I think if you talk to any law enforcement and you talk to judges that deal with these things, DAs, public defenders, we're dealing with the same people over and over and over. And they go to prison, and it would be a deterrent for me, I assure you. But it is not a deterrent for someone with an addiction issue. And ultimately, if they go back to the same environment that got them into this trouble to begin with, and they associate with the same people, places, and things that prompted that drug abusing behavior, they are going to reoffend. It's really only a matter of when, not if. And that's really the recognition that we've come to in addressing these concerns. There is a smarter way to address those particular individuals.
That's what we're trying to get to. And I thank you for your perspective on that. That's the target right there. Before we go to questions, I'm going to recognize Judge Bagley. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Well, thank you all for hearing us out this morning. And I will try to give you a little bit of the benefit of my experience as a drug court judge since 2004 and serving on the national board of drug court professionals. I also have been heard a lot of different perspectives across the country as well. And different states do it different ways. And this is Georgia. This is not Michigan. This is not California. Things that they do in Michigan and California, I probably wouldn't say would be good to do here in Georgia.
Let me ask you to do one thing, and I apologize for interrupting. Just for the edification of some members who may not be familiar, could just give us a quick primer on the difference between pre-adjudication and post-adjudication?
Yes. Pre-adjudication. I run primarily a pre-adjudication court, although I take in some post-adjudication cases. Pre-adjudication is where the district attorney refers a case to our program, say, a felony drug case, possession of methamphetamine, whatever kind of drug, and we accept the person into our program. Our program's an 18-month program, by the way. And if the person is successful and graduates, the DA will dismiss the charges. Even though they plead guilty, they have to plead guilty to come in, but they're not sentenced. Therefore, it's a pre-adjudication. There's no judgment. There's no sentence, So when they graduate, the DA will dismiss the charges. The guilty plea goes away. They're never a convicted felon. That's a pre-adjudication court. Post-adjudication is they've already been sentenced. And the way it works in my court is I will take in some probation cases where they've already been sentenced. They violate their probation by usually testing positive for drugs. And then after some time of incarceration, because they're on probation, then they can come into my program as a post-adjudication case. And I'm going to get right to the heart of this, right to the meat of it, talking about the high risk and high needs that you've got in your bill here. And the sentence that I'm referring to is, I think, the same one. The work plan shall ensure that drug court division eligibility shall be focused on moderate risk and high risk offenders as determined by a risk and needs assessment. Big difference between risk and needs. Risk is you got a 5-time felony offender, that's a high risk person. High needs is you do a clinical assessment, of that person when they come into drug court, and my clinician, my drug court coordinator says, when I go around the table, I ask, first of all, look to my drug court coordinator after the DA says, okay, they can come in. And that's a separation of powers issue I'll get to in just a few minutes. But the drug court coordinator says, okay, I did a clinical on this person, and I say, all I want, are they an addict or are they just an abuser? Big difference. If they're an addict, we want them in. If they've just abused drugs once, they don't need drug court. So we want the high needs person in, the one who assesses out as a high needs, they are a true drug addict or they're close to it. You can't. There's no bright line, but we want to be assured that this person really needs our program before we expend resources to help this individual. So we get them in on high needs. Big difference. High risk is multiple felony offender. That's when you get into the separation of powers issue in a pre-adjudication court. My district attorney in Forsyth County, Georgia, is not going to allow a 5-time felony offender into my pre-adjudication court and say, okay, this 5-time felony offender is going to come into drug court, then I'm going to dismiss their possession of meth charge at the end of the 18 months. She has to run for election. Judges have to run for election. This is, yes, the studies show, just like Judge Boggs said, that high risk and high needs, that is the main population that is going to be most successful. But you got to look at the political reality, and that in my circuit, my very conservative circuit, my district attorney is not going to allow in these 5-time felony offenders into our program. It's just not going to happen. So you got to look at the political reality of it. I don't mind you putting in aspirational language about, this is what the studies show should be happening, but give us a little wiggle room so that we can say, okay, no doubt we've got to have high needs people in there, but it's not a cookie cutter. Judge Downs in Fulton County, she takes in high risk people. I mean, but her constituency in Fulton County is different than mine in Forsyth County. It's just totally different. So you can't. I would respectfully request that you not put in language that would hamstring some different parts of the state, because there is a separation of powers issue. I can't say, DA, I don't care that you don't like 5-time felony offender. I want him in. Can't do that because it's her case. She says, Judge, I'm going to prosecute this case. I'm going to jury trial with this case. So I can't tell her to bring this 5-time felony offender in. Okay? She has to make that decision, and she's not going to do it. Okay? So that's the DA is the gatekeeper. I wrote an article about all this in the June 2008 edition of the Bar Journal. So if you get a chance to go back and look at it, if you want some bedtime reading, you might want to check it out. But it is a legal article, but it does talk about separation of powers and how we have to, there is a fine line. Drug court is a unique animal. It's supposed to be non-adversarial. It's the team approach that we work off the team approach. But there is a fine line there you have to walk. We have to abide by our oaths, our constitutional duties. So does the district attorney. There has to be that separation of powers. We can do that and still adhere to the 10 key components in the team approach. And I've laid out how, through my experience of being a drug court judge for 8 years now or so, that it can be done. But it is a fine line, and you have to really be careful not to cross those boundaries. And
well, that leads to a question, and Judge Boggs touched on this earlier about statewide standards, rules, judicial council, or whoever coming up with, as we have in the bill, with best practices. What do you have to adhere to or not adhere to? It seems to me that we have some really good drug courts in this state,
right? And
with varying approaches. We have a good one in Cobb, run by Judge George Krieger. Was one of the first. Mm-hmm. If we go ahead and standardize and try to bring in uniformity, which always sounds good around here. Let's be consistent. Let's be uniform. Let's be that sounds great, but that may not. What I'm hearing you say, Judge, and Judge Boggs, you touched on it as well, is that may not be the best way to go, because if we want to go ahead and be effective in a particular jurisdiction, we don't want to tie the hands of local officials to do what they need to do within their realm of reality. I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as political. It just could be purely philosophical,
Right.
how they go ahead and approach things. That's a reflection of the community. So maybe we shouldn't put together a statewide standard and have the Judicial Council or whoever promulgate rules and regs on this type. Well, not regs, but you know what I mean, rules on this type of thing.
So let me be very clear. I fully support standards. In fact, as
But
chair
flexible standards.
As chair of the Accountability
Okay.
Courts Committee,
Right.
we need standards. In fact, we're working on them now, we being the committee that I chair, because of some of the things that have happened, in the state that have been in the news, and we need standards. We've got to have more detailed standards than just the 10 key components. We've got to drill. That's what we're trying to do, is drill down in the 10 key components and say, these are the details about what you do to run a good drug court program, and this is what you need to do. You need to have court every week. You need to have the judge sitting on the bench every week talking to these people. You need to have, that's just an example, but there's a lot of standards that, yes, we need to have. And in considering the state grants, the state monies that may be coming, we want to our committee or whatever committee that addresses these courts that are wanting money, we need to be able to tell them, look, these are the state standards. You have to adhere to these state standards before you can, before we're going to give you some money. I mean, that there has to be more detailed standards, and we're working on that, and have no problem with that whatsoever. I'm just saying, in the language about this high risk and to moderate risk to high risk, that's not going to necessarily work in every judicial circuit in this state. But there are certain standards that will need to be adhered to in every circuit in this state in order to run a true drug court program that adheres to the 10 key components and is not, it is a true program. So
Chairman,
yes.
I'm sorry, Chairman Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your commitment in your courts, and not only in your courts, but what you're doing to enhance accountability courts across the state. I commend you and appreciate what you do, and I like to hear you talking about the difference between the addict and the abuser, because there's a huge difference between the addict and the abuser, and if we don't understand that difference between the offender, it is impossible to have an effective court. It is impossible to have effective outcomes. And one of the things that makes the court effective is that you move from that model that has been the historic model in the state of Georgia, which is we punish the criminal behavior. And you move to the model of we recognize the addiction, and while there has to be accountability to the criminal behavior, and sometimes the criminal behavior escalates to the point to where drug court's not appropriate, and we need to put them somewhere to protect society from them. But with many of these offenders, that criminal behavior is not a public safety threat. It's more of a here we go again, having to deal with you again situation. And if we can take care of that addiction, that criminal behavior takes care of itself. Speak to us a little bit about the importance of the treatment piece within your courts. And we know that the accountability piece is huge, and the sanctions piece is huge, but speak to us a little bit about the treatment piece within your courts.
Well, I mean, it's obviously the most important part of a treatment program. The challenge to a state as large as Georgia with 49 judicial circuits, and this kind of goes to the questions that Judge Bagley has suggested about, one size does not fit all. And the treatment component, there are licensed clinical addiction counselors licensed in this state that we traditionally use, but they're not available all over the state. In my program, had to contract with my community service board. They provided those counselors through contracts. There are private providers. There are a myriad of ways to provide the service component to the addict. In the end of the day, that is the most important part, in my opinion, to the model, a successful model for a drug court program. When Judge Bagley refers to the 10 key components, he's referring to the standards promulgated by the National Drug Court Institute, which are aspirational guidelines within which you must run the program. And it tells you that you need to hold court regularly, there needs to be swift sanctioning to offenses and so forth. But in the end of the day, the clinical component, the treatment component, is the part that I think that's changing the behavior. Now, it all goes together from a clinical standpoint. I mean, it's important that if an individual tests positive in Judge Bagley's drug court today, that person be sanctioned rather quickly, and that it not take 3 months to get them out of the county jail into a probation revocation case or into a the drug court case. So all of it goes hand in hand. But going back to your question about standards, I agree with what Judge Bagley says. The most important part about the bill that as has been drafted is you basically lifted the same recommendations that were in the recommendation of the council and codified them or purport to, and you're allowing the Judicial Council to promulgate those standards. And quite frankly, that is the body best capable, Judge Bagley's committee, I serve on that committee, but that understand the need for flexibility to allow for geographic and philosophical differences among the 49 judicial circuits. And so uniformity is important. Fiscal accounting and responsibility and reporting of data is important, but you're allowing the Judicial Council Standing Committee to fashion those standards. And so I think that's very important. I know Judge Goss and Judge Goslin are going to speak to that issue because you've mirrored the same language in this bill relative to mental health courts. But in the end of the day, we all agree that uniformity of practices is important. It helps the concerns about outliers, and I think it's a very, very strong part of this bill that will improve results.
Judge, let me make sure. Is the light on the bottom there?
It is.
All right.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Willow. I'm sorry, Mr. Neal. Do you have a follow-up? Sure.
I also appreciate hearing you talk about the medical and the physiological aspects of the length of the program, and when you can get an offender engaged in treatment and accountability for that kind of period of time, the success rate is very clear from these accountability courts. I read a study this morning actually with drug offenders that are incarcerated, and incarcerating a drug offender pulls them out of society, and it deters the criminal behavior while they're pulled out, but it does very little, if anything, to change the needs of those offenders. As a matter of fact, the study that I read this morning said that within the first year, 70 to 85% of drug offenders that are incarcerated are using drugs again. Within 3 years, 95% of them are using drugs again. What does that tell us about the likelihood of criminal recidivism if they're going back to the behavior that likely was the cause of the criminal behavior in the beginning with those individuals?
Well, certainly the numbers speak for themselves. You put somebody in jail, you incarcerate them. They're a drug addict going in. They're going to be a drug addict coming out with no treatment, and that means they're going to go right out and try to find the drugs that they were using before. It's just there's been no change in their behavior. There's been no modification of their behavior while they're incarcerated without any treatment. So drug courts provide that treatment. I think the symbol for the National Association is the gavel with the serpent wrapped around it, which is, of course, medical and legal working together to effectuate a positive result. And that's what drug courts are all about, is combining the judicial accountability with the treatment part. And if they don't do what they're supposed to do, we put them in jail for a few days, and then we modify their behavior that way. And finally, after about 6 months, we begin to see a change in their behavior. They begin to sort of get it. Most of them do, and then they go on to be successful.
Can you speak a little bit to that low risk, low needs offender? That the low risk, low needs offender doesn't perform well in a drug court. The low risk, low needs offender, if they're incarcerated, is going to come out far worse than they were when they were first put in. Can you speak a little bit about most effective approach with that low risk, low needs offender?
Actually, the studies show the low risk, low needs offender will actually do okay because they don't really need the drug court to start with. They'll have no problem with testing negative on all their screens. They'll just go through the motions and go through the program and graduate, and we'll have expended resources on them that we didn't need to expend. Okay, so we don't even need to talk about low risk, low needs people. the question is about low risk, high need versus high risk, high need. Low risk, high need is your individual who hasn't had much experience with the criminal justice system, but who is a drug addict. Okay, and I'm not going to repeat myself, but in a lot of pre-adjudication courts, those are the ones that come in, are your low risk, high needs individuals. They're going to be helped. Now, a lot of those individuals are young, and we have a lot of young ones in our program. We have, 18, 19, 20-year-old. Now, a lot of them have not yet gotten sick and tired of being sick and tired. You've all heard, some of you may have heard that phrase. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. A lot of those young ones have not gotten to that point yet. We have a greater challenge of reaching those young ones in our programs and trying to change their behavior than we do someone who's 40 years old and is sick and tired of being sick and tired. But they've been charged with a felony drug offense. They're still a high needs individual. They're an addict, and they still would qualify for our program. We just have a greater challenge in changing their behavior. Okay? So that's the big difference. High risk, high needs, those individuals who've been in prison before, but they've got a drug addiction, they're sick and tired of being sick and tired. They're ready to change their life more than your low risk, high needs person.
Thank you.
And lastly, I would say the data that you're referring to, you all are aware that the Georgia Department of Audits conducted an audit of the drug court programs a couple years ago and published their findings. It was pretty remarkable. The numbers emulated what you're reading from now, very similar, that they identified a number of nonviolent drug offenders that were in your state prison system that, but for the fact that a drug court program wasn't available in their sentencing circuit, could have probably been more effectively treated in that circuit and through such a program.
Senator Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is primarily to Judge Bagley, but Judge Boggs spoke to it as well. Last year I had an opportunity to work a lot on the mental health court legislation, and it mirrors the drug court, and again there's that mirroring that comes along with this language. But I want to go back to your philosophy about, I guess, maybe standards versus mandated policies and procedures. And I think if I were leaving it up to you, the two of you, I would probably agree with most of your philosophy. But the current language says the standards that are set by the Judicial Council, I believe. And my concern is that anytime we have mandated policies and procedures, I think that's going to probably reduce that flexibility that's down in the local drug courts and mental health courts, and probably squash whatever innovation by those courts. So would y'all speak a little bit of that? Are we going in the wrong direction? I don't have any problem with creating more robust standards, and I think we can do that with current language, but are we going in the wrong direction in trying to mandate policies and procedures?
I think when you try to mandate some of these things through legislation, that it could hamstring some of the courts. I'm all for standards, and as I've said before, but getting too deep into the weeds could really do more damage than it could do. That could benefit the courts across the state. I will say there's a section in here that I was very concerned about maybe something about the CJCC conducting an audit of each drug court division and that kind of thing. While that sounds good, that's going to require staff and personnel, and you're going to have, when you think about that, you're going to have some bureaucrat from Atlanta, maybe just fresh out of college, coming up to my drug court in Forsyth County and telling me how to run my drug court. And I've been a drug court judge for 8 years. What we need more than having more people on the state payroll is peer review, so that judges like myself can go to Brunswick or Waycross or somewhere, and maybe I can have a senior judge, that I can have sit for me for that day in my court on my regular caseload, and I can go down to South Georgia and sit with the judge and maybe their staff down there, and maybe make some suggestions about what they might need to be doing better, that would be better practices or something of that nature, rather than having some auditor, some bureaucrat from Atlanta coming down and telling the judge what to do. That's not going to go over too well, I can tell you that. So that's
pretty
one
clear.
area that I would suggest.
I don't know that I want to talk after that.
That's why we're here, to hear exactly things like that.
Senator, I think you would find unanimity among the Superior Court judges to agree to participate outside of their circuit in a peer review process to ensure conformity with published standards by the Judicial Council. We've talked about it when I was a Superior Court judge and on the Executive Committee, and I think that is a very good way to ensure collaboration and also ensure compliance with published standards. Now, with respect to the argument that published standards may somehow impede innovation, I agree. And that's why it's important to me, I would think, that the legislature not codify eligibility standards, for example. Leave those issues to the Judicial Council Standing Committee on Accountability Courts. I think the goal of that committee, and interestingly, you all should know, we are about 8 months ahead of the National Drug Court Institute promulgating their own standards. This concept of having some standards, not enough to tie innovation or to impede discretion or to impede what might happen geographically or philosophically among a large state like Georgia, but rather the national folks realize there need to be some standards in addition to and a little more in-depth than the 10 key components that have now been, and I think the judges in this state would agree with that. But we're going to be ahead of the curve on that. And, it may be that after they promulgate their standards, we decide we want to adjust and amend the standards that have been promulgated by the Judicial Council. But the Judicial Council, I would think, is the right entity to do that, and it's important to me that you not get so deep into legislation that you tie the hands of innovative judges, because indeed there are a lot of unique things going on in this state. I would suggest even to that council, to the Judicial Council, that they provide a waiver process. They provide some waiver process by which an innovative judge in Cordele could say, look, I don't have the same resources they have in Gwinnett County. I'm going to have to do something a little unique that may not mirror exactly what your standards say, but as long as I submit data and that data suggests that it's working to reduce recidivism, to do so at a fiscally responsible cost and to ensure public safety, they ought to be allowed to do it. And so I appreciate you bringing that issue up, because it's an important issue to the judges that run mental health courts and drug courts.
Mr. Willard.
Thank you. Judge, I'm going to ask both of you. The bill talks about use of risk and needs assessments. Is that currently done by the courts?
You want to talk to me first?
As far as individual courts, we do what's called an ASI, and that's more of a needs, what I was talking about needs assessment, to determine whether this person really has a problem with drugs or not. And that's more of what we do. A risk assessment is really just looking at their record.
Okay.
I mean,
so it's not something as a document or a program that is uniform, I call
no.
it, applied by saying, here's what you need to do, sit down and have this person go through some type of testing.
Corrections, Mr. Chairman, has a tool that they use, and I could ask as a sentencing judge when I was a trial judge that they prepare me a pre-sentence report that addresses criminogenic needs, that addresses socioeconomics of the particular offender, and gives me some more data on predictability of that offender reoffending. And that goes to the criminogenic and the risk side. On all drug courts in Georgia, I think clinically, and use some tool, ASI or others, to address the needs factor. I know my drug court did. They used the ASI tool. But there are tools that are done, I think, routinely now. All your drug courts are interviewing pre-admission all of these potential candidates and determining if they're addicts or if they're abusers, and determining, whether ultimately, based on their needs, they will benefit from the expenditure that the court's going to go through to try to help their problem. This is proposing a new tool, a new risk and needs assessment tool that marries both of those concepts. And while laudable, I think it can be. We've never seen that tool, and so
I wonder, is there one?
Well,
nationally, anybody know?
I don't know.
You've never seen or heard of it? Okay.
No,
well, that's something to keep in mind. Let me follow up on another point. we talk about people who are arrested for drugs. We have a lot of people who are in need. Well, they're drug addicts, but they're doing petty crimes, breaking in cars, breaking in houses, burglaries, whatever. They have drug problems. Are we also recognizing that person may be someone who qualifies or not?
Yes, I do in my program. Like, as I said, I take in some post-adjudication cases where they're already on probation. They could be on probation for burglary. And, you know, if they test positive for drugs on a probation revocation, I could say, okay, you qualify for my drug court. I'm going to let you back out on the condition that you complete my drug court program. But they're already sentenced for burglary. They've already been punished for that original crime, but yet I'm adding another component, a drug court. So yes,
possession is not the only thing.
It's not. In fact, the current Title 15, Mr. Chairman, that sets up the enabling statute for drug court statute says that any court that has jurisdiction over any criminal case which arises from the use, sale, possession, or delivery of drugs. And quite honestly, I hate to bring up a topic that kept y'all busy yesterday, but you know, metal theft is quite common. Copper theft, I saw it regularly. That is a drug case. It doesn't appear as one to a layperson, but it certainly is almost always.
For the record, the House Judiciary Non-Civil Committee did pass out a metal theft enforcement bill.
One last
night.
Matter, if I might, Mr. Chairman. What I hear and I've heard before is it takes a partnership between the prosecuting attorney and the judge to have a what I call working drug court. In some jurisdictions we don't have it. What would be a way of doing a stick and carrot, I guess, situation to try and get more of the judges and prosecutors, where there may not be a court, to buy into that program? We can't force it, can we?
I don't think you can, Mr. Chairman. Probably to me, and this may be incorrect, but my general perception on why we don't have more drug courts is premised basically on two things. One, lack of resources. Almost inevitably, it's the treatment component. You know, every judicial circuit has a DA and a public defender and a judge. You have the integral components of a drug court, but the most important part, as we've discussed earlier, is the treatment side, and it's the same for mental health courts. And so that's the largest impediment, in my opinion, and I think the governor has helped us graciously with that by his commitment with his financial resources. Indeed, drug court is a collaborative effort, and it's not just between the judge and the DA, but all stakeholders, including the public defender and the defense bar, including law enforcement. They're at the table, including the treatment service providers, including probation. It is a really unique, non-adversarial approach to trying to address the problem, but that collaborative effort works really well. I guess you could speak to Mr. McDade or others about how we get more DAs on board, but I mean, we have DAs on board, and DAs understand the importance of it. I think the impediment there has been, you know, it's philosophical, and it's sometimes also political. You know, it's difficult to agree to take somebody that has a GCIC that has 20 or 25 dispositions on it. It's difficult for everybody involved, and so I think that's a work in progress, and I think what we need to see, and probably what judges and DAs and politicians that are not yet buying into it, I think what they all need to see is some results. I think they need to see that these programs work. They work for high-risk offenders. Sometimes they work for low-risk offenders but high-need offenders. And ultimately that will probably bear fruit. I think that's probably, and that's really where we're starting with this and why this is so important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Abrams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as a former Atlanta bureaucrat, I want to tell you we're not all that bad.
I'm glad you said that.
I get to go home.
But I do have two questions that stem from that. I'm looking at the language that's in the bill, lines 233 through 236 on page 7. And Judge, I think, Judge Bagley, I think this is the language that you were referring to, and I do mean this as a friendly question. The way I read it, it essentially says that the CJCC conducts this audit every 3 years, but that information cannot be acted upon except by being sent to the Judicial Council of Georgia. And the way I read it, it seems to me to be a stopgap against the bad actions of some drug courts that have existed that we've all heard about. I don't quite see the danger of this language. Can you talk to me about why this causes you concern?
I really didn't reference this particular. I have no problem with audits being conducted. Yeah, and certainly I think our drug courts and mental health courts should be certified.
Okay.
Absolutely. But my issue is with the way the audits are conducted. I think that peer review should be. We should focus more on peer review. Judges auditing other judges' programs rather than with the assistance of staff, of course. But that's what I'm focusing on, is more the way in which these audits are conducted. I don't have a problem. In fact, I think we should audit and recertify and certify programs on a regular basis.
Okay.
Yeah, the language is for drug courts is on lines 124 through 127 on page 4, but it's the same language, I believe. Yeah. And I would echo those concerns. I think what's most important is the audit be conducted by folks that are intimately familiar with the inner workings of drug court programs, whether that's an outside source to ensure that there's not a manipulation of the system is fine. I don't think anybody's opposed to that. I think the idea of using judges is novel, but if it causes concern, maybe there's a better way to do that.
If I may follow up, one additional question that I had is the notion of a tiered system. Recognizing the difference in resources, I think, is a valuable issue. Have you all thought about whether it made sense to create sort of a tiered structure that recognizes the difference in resources in a Fulton County versus a Blakely County versus Scrubbing County?
I think you kind of have that now in the nature of we have 33 or 34 post-adjudication drug courts in Georgia. You have DUI and mental health courts. Everybody's kind of doing their own thing based on what resources they have, what their target audience is, what their problem is. And, I think that's really integral in what we're doing already. I know there has been I proposed in my court and have suggested to others that we have different tracks, maybe. Mm-hmm. You have a track maybe for high-risk offenders to the extent everybody's agreeable to putting them in. But it's all resource-driven. And so I think you build it around whatever resources you're able to pay for.
Well, my point would be to the issue of trying to force everyone into the same bucket. I think it's a legitimate concern that what Fulton County has access to is not replicated in other states, other counties. And so if there is going to be a superstructure, does it make sense to create within that superstructure a tiered system that recognizes and allows counties to move up or down based on their access to resources, which would allow you to create the sort of omnibus management system that seems to want to create, but also recognizes the limitations that may exist within counties?
Well, I think that with the proposed appropriations that we're possibly looking at, that the playing field is going to be somewhat leveled across the state. And I think that's what the governor, at least that's what I interpreted him proposing to do, is sort of leveled so that Fulton County doesn't have more resources than some county in South Georgia. That there are treatment providers that are placed in these areas, these circuits that don't have drug courts. But there are certain standards that will apply whether you're in rural Georgia or whether you're in Atlanta. And those are, just for example, the judge needs to regularly meet with the participants, needs to have some time, face-to-face time with each participant. The judge needs to, do that, and to, have the staffing and have all the persons that need to be there around the table to discuss each participant every week. It needs to be regular. There's a lot of other standards that will not vary. They're going to be standard across the state. It's not going to vary between rural and urban, but some of the eligibility stuff that I've been talking about will vary between rural and urban and suburban areas of the state, because they're not all the same. And I think eligibility is where I was focusing on.
Oh, thank you.
Mr. Jacobs.
This is just a more basic question that follows on to both the questions of Representative Abrams and Chairman Willard. You said there are 33 to 34 post-adjudication drug courts, so that's 33 to 34 circuits have them? Is that?
No, sir. For example, the Brunswick Circuit has two separate entities within that circuit that are operating separately drug court programs.
Okay. So how many circuits have them?
There are 49 circuits, and I think 13 circuits do not have them.
Okay.
So there are 13 circuits in the state that do not have any accountability courts.
And are there, of those 13, are there any noteworthy population centers that do not have them?
You want me to? Well, Rome doesn't have one.
Well,
I don't know if there's anybody here from Rome or not, but you asked me.
Okay.
They're not all rural.
They're not all rural, no.
Okay.
No.
Thank you.
Mr. Weldon.
To the judges there, when you have a pre-adjudication program, then you have a post-adjudication program, and you have approximately about a 10% recidivism after these folks have completed it. Is that close?
That's close, 7 to 10%. Yeah, 7.
In a pre-adjudication program, the stigma of being a convicted felon doesn't go with that person. In a post-adjudication program, these people that are completing that, they do, I'm assuming that they will have the, when an employer goes to get the NCIC report for an employer and they see that, they'll see a conviction. Is that right?
Not necessarily. My post-adjudication program provided that they have to plead to the offense. I give them, impose a sentence, which is generally what's been offered by the district attorney's office. Sometimes the sentence that they get, well, in some instances, the coming into drug court is going to make the sentence more onerous, and I'm always clear with them that they understand that. But in the end of the day, the drug court program that I ran and others in this state provide that upon successful completion and graduation from the drug court program, that A, they will file a motion to withdraw their previously entered plea of guilty, and it will be unopposed by the DA's office, and the judge will grant that motion. Secondly, and very importantly to your question, they are allowed to seek expungement of their record for employment purposes, not law enforcement purposes, and the state, the DA in this case, in my circuit and in others, agrees not to oppose it. And so, indeed, that is the carrot and stick program that we ran that was looked to the fact that you do not want to, for somebody that's completed a program and reduced their likelihood of recidivism and completed this really onerous 2-year program, to also have them worry about getting a job. Now, they had to get a job while they were in the program, but to the extent that they wanted their record cleared, that was part of the program that I developed, is that they have that right if they graduate to seek expungement. You know, expungement in Georgia is not done by the state. It's not done by the judge. It's done by the defendant. But if the defendant files the appropriate paperwork, state won't oppose it. And in the future, when all's done, not only will the disposition portion of their GCIC that reflects their arrest be gone, but most importantly will be gone the conviction portion of their GCIC. Right. So for employment purposes, it's all gone. For law enforcement purposes, it's not. They can still see it to the extent they need to have access to it.
Thank you. And if I could, Mr. Chairman, make one comment. I think your approach to peer review is well taken. And I don't know really how to articulate it other than by example, or just to give you an example. You know, if we're building a house or we're building the things that are in this room, and we get some inputs, like some of the wood or the chairs aren't what we asked for, the tables aren't what, we send it back. You don't have that luxury where you are. You know, it's like a school. A public school gets what is brought to them, and you do. And to me, I think that's a compelling reason to approach it that way, and I think you got the right idea.
Thank you.
Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Wanted to go back to a comment you made a little bit earlier. One of the things that we're looking to do is we're looking to find the best way to utilize Georgia taxpayer dollars to get the best outcomes and promote public safety. And in doing that, one of the things that's important in doing is looking at those evidence-based practices and knowing what fits, knowing what knowing what is appropriate based on the needs of those offenders. And by the way, another thing we talked about was risk needs assessment. There's money in the 13 amended budget from the governor's proposals for the Department of Corrections to do that Georgia-specific region needs risk assessment piece, and hopefully we'll be able to get that done. But I'm wondering, you talked about the political ramifications in some circuits of trying to put those high risk, high needs offenders into drug courts, and we know based on what works in drug courts that those are the ones where you see the most. Those are where you bend the curve the most, is with those high risk, high needs. If we have drug courts that are looking to only go for the easy, what they perceive to be the easy, and they're taking out those where we're seeing the curve bent the most, are we effectively using Georgia taxpayer monies by allowing those courts that are shying away from the areas that we had the most success, or are we being practical in the way we use our money?
It's been my experience, and this is just my opinion, that high needs is, to answer your question, the best expenditure of taxpayer money. High needs is more, I don't want to say more important, but it's, to me, a greater factor than the high risk, because you want to be able, as I said earlier, to change the behavior of drug addicts. And I'm not going to name any names, but there were some programs in the state that had huge numbers in their drug court program, but yet they were taking in abusers in addition to that, and so they were not utilizing the resources to the most efficient way, and that is to treat drug addicts, not just abusers, not just somebody who got caught with meth in their car. You know, they always say, this is the first time I ever had it, but I mean, you know, maybe it was.
Of course it is, and it probably wasn't theirs.
Right, exactly. That's what they say.
Yeah.
But truly, the high needs person, that's who we want to treat. Now, you're right. I mean, to get the most bang for the buck, you do go for the ones who say, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. That's your high risk, high needs. The ones who've seen the inside of a prison before. They're sick and tired of being. So you're right. But there is that friction in, you know, we want to serve that population, but again, you have the DAs are here. I'm not going to speak for them, but you have that friction, that separation of powers that says a DA may say, you know, I don't really like, you know, putting in somebody in our drug court program, but I'm going to dismiss their drug charge at the end when they've got 5 or 6 felony offenses on their record. There's a friction there, and I'm not saying that the studies don't show that. You're right. The biggest bang for the buck is the high risk, high needs, but there is that friction.
Any further questions from members of the committee? Seeing none, Judge Bagley and Judge Boggs, thank you very much for taking the time to be here. We really appreciate it. We've got about half an hour until the lunch break, so I'm going to ask Mr. Head if we could wait until after lunch for your testimony and questions there. I think that'll take a little longer. I know that Judge Goslin, I know, who is involved in mental health courts. Is she still here? Yes. Oh, okay. Oh, great. And Judge Goss, great. If you wouldn't mind coming forward, we'd love to hear from you. We and I trust we can have a conversation in the 30 minutes we have until the break.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm sorry to put you in between now and the lunch break. That's
good morning.
Morning.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're handing out to you Judge Goslin and I collaborated on this, and I just happen to be the typist. So but what we've done is to try to
if you could pull the mic toward you, Judge. Thank you.
We've taken
Appreciate
the bill
it.
that was on the internet yesterday, And where there are some areas of concerns relating to mental health courts, we've referenced page and line numbers, maybe with some explanatory notes where there are some concerns. Attached to that memo is a publication called Improving Responses to People with Mental Illness, The Essential Elements of Mental Health Court. This is published by the Justice Department Bureau of Justice Assistants and the Council of State Governments in New York City. This is currently, nationally, the latest and greatest. Let me just tell you a bit, and Judge Goslin will tell you a bit about her program. But I've been running a felony mental health court and co-occurring substance abuse disorders court in Albany since 2002. We're one of the 5 national learning sites and one of the national data sites for mental health courts nationally for the Council of State Governments in New York City. Judge Goslin has been operating her program about as long as I have, and she'll tell you about that in a moment. But one thing to understand, a difference in the mental health courts and the drug courts is the mental health courts are about a decade newer across the nation than drug courts. Now, we've talked, and the reason I say that is to bring this up about standards. We've been throwing the term standards around, but I would like to point out, when we say standards in this field, standards has a specific definition. Standards means data-driven, research-vetted, peer-reviewed. The academics have looked at it, et cetera, et cetera. And as Judge Boggs and Judge Bagley noted, and I checked with the head of the National Drug Court Institute Tuesday in a meeting we were together at, NDCI, the National Drug Court Institute, hopefully by the end of this calendar year, will be publishing a list of national standards for drug courts after 20 years of data collection. We're not there yet with mental health courts. We're a decade newer. This publication is the framework. There are 10 essential elements, some of the things we've been talking about, how you target your population, how you drug test, how you make referrals for screenings and assessment. They're in here. And I would note to you that after Senator Grant carried the bill last year to get the mental health courts enabling statute passed, after that, Judge Goslin and myself, along with John Zoller at the AOC, drafted and the Judicial Council adopted some guidelines. I like that word better. Some guidelines for mental health court programs, and they adopt by express reference this most up-to-date national publication. With that, I'll let Judge Goslin give you some introductory remarks, and then we've got a few specifics we want to talk about, if that's okay.
I've been running a mental health court since 2004, and it's both post-adjudication, pre-adjudication. We include misdemeanors as well as felons. The charges that people have when they come into mental health court run the range of a misdemeanor obstruction to a felony aggravated assault, and all kinds of things in between, including possession of drug cases. Between 60 and 70% of the folks in the court have a co-occurring disorder, so they have both drug dependence or alcohol dependence and mental illness. The other 30 to 40% have just a mental illness. This is a very different group. Because there's such a wide variety of charges, because people come with all sorts of different functioning levels, there needs to be as much flexibility as possible when you're dealing with that group. So I wanted to preface our comments by that, note about the difference between mental health courts and drug courts.
And as Judge Goslin just mentioned, there's a high comorbidity in this population for a co-occurring alcohol or substance problem. Approximately 70% of the people that flow through the mental health court programs across the country have a co-occurring alcohol or substance problem, many times because they're self-medicating. They're drinking themselves to sleep when they have bipolar disorder and are not appropriately medicated. They are smoking marijuana to blunt the auditory hallucinations when they're schizophrenic but not on appropriate prescriptions there. So it is very common to see both issues in this population. The comments that we're going to make are going to be very specific to shall we say, on-the-ground issues in operating these court programs. There are currently 14 that I know of, mental health court programs in Georgia, scattered across the state. Judge Weaver, who's in the audience, is running one in the Appalachian Circuit. I run one in Albany. Judge Goslin in Gainesville, and they're all over the state. One of the things we were concerned about in the memo, there are several places in the provisions dealing with mental health courts that uses the term mandatory. It just goes back to the same thing you heard from Judge Bagley and Judge Boggs. There are no gold standards. We need some flexibility. Now understand, we, the two of us, completely agree that there needs to be some fundamental basic tenets, such as found in this document, that every mental health court program should comply with. But there needs to be flexibility to recognize there may be some services available in Metro Atlanta that are not available in rural Georgia, and you have to be adaptable to address that. So the term mandatory, when it's used 6 or 8 times in that much text, tends to start saying standardization, and I would at least ask you to give that some thought. The low risk, high needs issues already been addressed, particularly in the mental health courts arena. We see a lot of people who have the repetitive, they're worn out with welcome with the family and the neighbors. They're off their medicine. They're walking around half dressed in the yard. The police get called. They get a disorderly, or they have a drug test failure, and they're repetitious. They're in and out of the jail, in and out of the jail, in and out of the jail, in and out of the state hospital. They're not necessarily a high risk of violence, but they're repetitive, and we want the flexibility when the clinical staff and the treatment staff and the DAs who are involved in these vettings recommend taking a person into the program.
So that they're not just, they might be low risk on some kind of a scale, but they're chronic offenders and they use up a lot of resources, both in hospital bed time and in jail beds and sometimes in prison.
I know this is criminal justice reform, but all of you are sensitive also to the utilization of bed spaces in the state hospital. Extraordinarily expensive. And these programs have proven effective in reducing that utilization. So that's a collateral but key issue also. One thing I also want to mention, the risk needs tool, assessment tool. I think most programs use some facet of that, but please understand this. It is absolutely fundamental to a mental health court. It's in these 10 essential elements. You have to have a licensed clinician involved in the team. I'm a JD, not an MD. I'm a lawyer, not a doctor. I'm not qualified to say whether someone has schizophrenia or someone has schizoaffective disorder or bipolar disorder. I'm not. You have to have a licensed professional counselor or a clinical social worker, somebody who has the licensure Georgia requires to make those diagnostic calls and to make the recommendation, this is what this person needs to be treated. That has to be an integral piece of the front end work and the ongoing work, because many times you get these people in the programs and you think you have one thing when you start, and then you get them sober and the fog burns off and you realize, wait a minute, we've got an altogether different constellation of issues here to deal with. Please keep that in mind. One thing on the data sets that are to be collected, we like I said, we've done a lot of work with data collection for the Bureau of Justice Assistance with mental health boards. It talks about participant employment, and I'll let Judge Goslin talk about that.
Well, that probably is a good statistic to keep for drug courts, but it's not very helpful a statistic to keep for mental health courts. At least half, if not more, of our participants don't work, won't ever work. They're on long-term disability. And so keeping that statistic is not helpful. I do think we should keep statistics, but I don't want us to keep statistics that are going to hurt programs and not give us any benefit. And that's one for mental health courts that is not appropriate, we don't think.
One item I'd like to address that's in page 7, 4F, 233 through 236, that Representative Abrams, I believe you addressed that question earlier about the audits. I have absolutely no problem with other judges anywhere in this state coming in and peer reviewing my program. We're one of the national teaching sites. I have judges coming from all other states coming in to look at our program. I get something from that every time somebody visits. You know, the dialogue, the back and forth dialogue you have with people about what are you doing, how do you do it, things of that nature. I have no problem with that. I do have concern when we start talking about audits, because audits, in my mind, looks at standards. If a CPA audits the books at your private business, they're working under the national accounting standards outlined by the National Boards of Accountancy. There are no standards like that, no gold standards for mental health courts. And I'm concerned that when we talk in terms of a performance audit, if some, non-judicial, somebody that's not experienced in running a treatment court comes into my court and unilaterally says, well, Judge, your program just doesn't meet muster. We're shutting you down. I don't have any way of taking a gold standard list of objective standards to say, well, you dropped the ball here. We met this, and we met this, and we met this, and we met this. The way this language is in there, I'm concerned, almost leaves it unilaterally in the discretion of whoever it is that's coming to review can say thumbs up or thumbs down, and that's it. There's no appeal mechanism if I disagree. So I would urge you to sort of dovetail on what Judge Bagley and Judge Boggs talked about, to consider this idea of peer review, of maybe setting it up so periodically some experienced judges from treatment courts, other places, maybe with a staff person to come with them to do these reviews and then report back to whomever you deem appropriate.
One last thing that I wanted to add is that, and Senator Grant sort of mentioned this about the innovation, and we don't want to chill innovation. There is, the way the bill's written now, there is so much with the audit, with the certification process, with the mandatory language. It is pretty onerous. And so if we want to continue, and I know that Governor Deal does want to have an accountability court in every circuit, or something that looks close to an accountability court, we're going to chill folks from doing that if it looks too hard to do, too difficult, too rigid. We're not saying that there shouldn't be uniformity to some extent, and that there shouldn't be standards, certain levels that people have to meet, but to make it completely rigid and regulatory in the scheme, I think would chill new programs from starting. Judge Weaver is here. She runs a drug court, a mental health court. She has a veterans treatment court. How many? What else? She has every court you can imagine. And part of it is because she is incredible. Well, she is innovative and has a lot of resources and an enormous amount of energy. So we don't want to chill folks like her from starting a new court.
And if I may, one final thing, and we'll take any questions. It was mentioned earlier about a tiered approach. Judge Goslin and I appeared before some of you on Chairman Powell's appropriation subcommittee 2-3 weeks ago. And one of the things we talked about is the fact that there probably is not going to be a mental health court in every county in Georgia, because you have to have a certain amount of volume court-wise to make it work out. And you have to have clinicians available. And so what we talked about that day was the possibility, and I'm not speaking for Mr. Cooper, who I saw here earlier from the Department of Corrections and Probation, but hopefully as we move forward, we need to take a look as a state maybe at, for really small counties that need some help on specific cases but may not have the volume to have a separate mental health court docket, that maybe there can be some services built in that state probation, for example, could deliver into that county. They may not have but 2 or 3 such cases a month, but they really need help with those 2 or 3 cases a month.
Well, we appreciate your comments. And the last thing you said rung true with me. I mean, some people may have this vision of having a drug court in every circuit, but or every county or in a circuit or whatever it may be, depending on the size. But if you don't have the what I'll call client base, for lack of a better, or customer base, for lack of a better term, coming from the business world, it's a waste of time and money. So we want to go where the need really is, regardless of where that is. I hope we don't. I hope we don't cherry pick for regional or other purposes, but really where the need is. That could be more. It'll be more so in metro because this is where more of the people are. That doesn't mean that any need either at the net line or south of that will not be addressed. It should be addressed just where the customer base is. And I couldn't agree with you more about not just having the drug court, but it's the infrastructure for the supervision afterwards. I've had conversation after conversation about drug courts can only go so far, but it is about keeping on them, regular supervision, regular testing. I mean, the old trust but verify. That's what we're talking about, and we're talking about years for a particular potential graduate of those programs. I know. So your comments are certainly well received, and we appreciate it. Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all. I know the work that y'all are doing, and I applaud you for it. Just one simple question, and you may have something statewide or national or maybe just anecdotal to your county, but do you have a sense for how much relief the presence of the drug court brings to the county jail with those mental health? Because I know that when you're talking about jails and prisons, you're talking about probably the largest provider of mental health services in the state. So can you speak to how much relief you all provide those county jails by your presence in the counties?
Tell them about the commissioner's statistic.
Go ahead.
Mr. Cooper can verify this because I did not know this. We were at a judge's meeting, our training meeting back in January when Commissioner Owens was presenting about the council. And I believe he stated that day that last year over 2,000 known mentally ill offenders that were out on parole probation had to be revoked back into the Harbed State Prison. 2 circuits, one had 2, one had 0. That one and this one.
One of the things that we're talking about with criminal justice reform is incentives for reductions in recidivism, and this is the perfect example when counties are able to do what you all are doing to reduce the cost to the state corrections department by not sending these offenders back into the prison system, but handling them within your jurisdictions in your mental health courts. You need some incentive funding to help you continue to do what you're doing. It ultimately saves the state a lot of money and allows those individuals to remain in the community and not be that drag. So again, thank you so much.
2 things I'd like to say about that, though. Please understand this is a high maintenance group of folks we're dealing with. Okay, they use up a lot of time and resources. Sometimes a win is they stay stable, stay in secure housing, stay on medicine, never get arrested again, and we all say thank you.
Yes.
But sometimes defining a win means taking that person who was averaging 3 arrests a year and 120 days in jail and narrowing it down to 1 arrest a year and 30 days in jail. We have to understand that. This is not perfection. Many times it's managing someone who has a chronic lifetime illness. If you're schizophrenic, unless there's a medical breakthrough or divine intervention, you're always going to be schizophrenic. And, that's just something we have to understand. The second thing I would mention, though, about the data, we did Applied Research Services, who did a lot of work for the council this summer, helped us develop a internet-based data system because, these people impact the state prison, the county jail, the local emergency room, the state hospital. Nobody has integrated budgets or computer systems. So this system was built to be internet-based so that the probation officer can key in data and the state hospital worker can key in data and it come to a central source. What we have found in our 10-year study is that what the judges talked about earlier, what Judge Boggs talked about earlier, where we have had the most significant cost savings is with the people that have been very chronic. Many times I have a reentry track, people coming back to Albany out of jail or prison that we've been dealing with for 25 years that are schizophrenic. When we can stabilize those folks and manage those folks and supervise those folks, that's where we're seeing the biggest return on the dollar, is because they use up so many resources.
And another point to make is we talk about the cost of incarceration, and what we always talk about is $48, $50 a day. Those individuals cost us more like $100 a day when they're in the prison system. So that's another thing to keep in mind as well.
Ms. Abrams, and then we'll break.
That's dangerous. It means I have to go fast.
No pressure.
So I want to ask you about lines 233 through 236, the audit piece, because what I'm trying to understand is the concern about the existence of an audit, who performs the audit, how often the audit's performed. Is it a process issue or a principal issue? And I guess that's where I'm a bit confused.
My personal concern is twofold. Audit, to me, is just like a CPA auditing financial records. When an auditor comes and audits financial records, they are working under national vetted standards of the National Boards of Accountancy, so that if you disagree with an audit finding, you have a way of saying, wait a minute. Because for mental health court, there are not yet any data researched standards, I'm concerned about the unilateral ability of someone that's coming in to just say, well, in my judgment, you don't meet the mark, you're closed. I think if you have peer review with experienced judges that have run these programs, maybe with a staff person, working with them, you're going to get a little broader perspective, and I think that's kind of what Judge Bagley and Judge Boggs were talking about earlier. The other part of it is simply that I'm concerned that if you have someone who has never run such a court program, it's going to be hard for them to objectively evaluate the program.
If the audit, because as I read all of these sections together, and I read the audit as being the way of gathering this information for the purposes of the Judicial Council of Georgia doing its recertification, because it's what happens after you've been certified the first time. I read it to say that the CJCC would be responsible for gathering the information, for not in the tax lawyer view of auditing, but in the audit as in, are they meeting the standards that were set? Let us gather that information and provide it to the JCJG, for their purposes. If that's what the purpose of the audit is that objectionable? Or because I guess my concern is what we're trying to achieve or avoid with the audit.
I hear the judges correctly. It's that there's a concern that they just might not know what to audit, how to audit it, what to look for, and therefore they're gathering information in an improper context, reporting it back to the Judicial Council, which may or may not be helpful in terms of determining their recertification going on. I guess if I hear correctly, it's about the subject matter expertise of the CJCC to come in there and to know what they know and know what they don't know.
So if
is that a
well,
correct?
And it's not so that this is not the executive branch versus judicial branch. It's non-judge, whether it's a judicial branch staff person.
So the question then would be, if the audit was only to provide the information necessary for the Judicial Council to make its recommendations for recertification,
maybe if it was called something else. That's part,
and that's what I'm trying to get to.
Because I'm not sure I understand the definition of audit. Judge Goss has a more specific definition in mind, but I think it would need to be fleshed out what that was, and then the fact that there aren't clear standards yet for mental health courts makes it difficult to know what they're going to be looking at.
And that would go to my final question, and I think Chairman Neal might actually be able to answer all of these. So then my secondary question would be to the concern about being too onerous in the regulations. If we try to explain it in this legislation, does that not create the secondary problem that you listed of having your hands tied? So So the question becomes, is it that we should get to a better definition of audit, or that we need to avoid the conversation altogether in the legislation?
I think that's a policy decision that I can't comment on. But let me say this. The way I read the bill as drafted, there's actually currently in here 2 reviews. There's the annual review that the Judicial Council, most likely Judge Bagley's Accountability Courts Committee, will do, which would be more of a paper review of statistics to certify these programs are certified for next year, and we send this to the executive branch, and to the legislative branch, and to the ASC. But there's also this second, right at the end of the bill, it talks about a separate, once every 3 years, what I envision as somebody walking in the door and saying, we're here to inspect, or we're here to review, or we're here to audit. And what we're suggesting is maybe it's a more prudent approach to let the whole thing be more of a peer review with reporting back to the appropriate branches of government and agencies.
Senator Grant, I saw your light. I don't want to walk out without recognizing you.
I think Judge Goss actually just hit on what I was going to say. It does seem like there's 2 different components in here. We have the requirement that we have the performance measurement and performance data that's reported annually, and I think that's something that needs to be reviewed, and I don't hear any objection from y'all for doing that as long as it's appropriate for your courts. And then you've got the audit function, and I think the audit function is not clearly defined here, and depending on what that actually calls for, it may be something that you find onerous, and I think you're asking that the peer review be considered for that part of it rather than the performance review things that come on an annual basis.
For myself and for Chairman Neal, just refresh our recollection on what the process is now.
Well, for mental health courts, there was, until this last year, there was no state money, so there was no process.
It's just everybody's doing their own thing as best they can with what they have.
That's right.
To use, to paraphrase Judge Boggs earlier.
That's right.
Okay.
Marshalling assets.
Oh, okay.
But for state funding, there has to be, they have to go through the Accountability Courts Committee that Judge Bagley has, and then there's a funding subcommittee, which some of you heard from with Judge Partain, and then those programs are looked at to get funding.
That seems to be an easily surmountable issue. So we really appreciate it. Judge Goslin, Judge Goss, thank you very much for being here. We'll be in recess till 1 o'clock. House Bill 1176, the criminal justice reform. I'd mentioned earlier that Pat Head, who's the district attorney for my circuit, the Cobb Judicial Circuit's been DA since 1998, had been solicitor prior to that, has been a defense lawyer, and is the chairman of the State Bar's Committee on Criminal Justice Reform. So that's a breadth of experience and roles and various hats, and so I think he's uniquely positioned to be of value, a real resource to the committee, much as our previous witnesses have as well. And so, Mr. Head, if you wouldn't mind coming forward so we can hear from you, and really the open-ended question, as we asked the judges earlier, and really all previous and future witnesses, is talk to us, and Mr. Keenan as well, obviously from the GBI, in looking over the bill, which again is just a starting point. And there'll be, let me just preface that a little bit more. There are some inconsistencies in the bill that we're aware of with the fits and starts of the legislative process, and some of the last minute that had to occur, which is no fault of counsel's. There are some sections that have to be cleaned up that are just very obvious, and that's fine. That's part of the drafting process. But really looking for more than anything, for instance, in the burglaries, there's an inconsistency in the burglary penalty section. We understand that. There are some other obvious glitches that have to be fixed. That's the easy part. The harder part is where there are potential structural issues, philosophical issues, practical issues, in terms of, well, this seems like a good idea, but here's how this is really going to affect fill in the blank, on a day-to-day basis. It's important we hear from the judges on that. It's important we hear from the GBI on that and other law enforcement. The DAs are certainly, relevant to that conversation. And again, in your capacity as chairman of the State Bars Committee on this issue, not necessarily a bar position, but anything you want to express on behalf of the bar is obviously welcome. That'll apply to the defense bar. It'll apply to all the interested parties. The retail association's coming tomorrow morning. So, that you see where we're going with that. So with that, I want to just open it up with, tell us the initial impressions about the bill. What is it, and specifically any problems that you see, structural or otherwise, that will hamper the prosecution community from doing its job on an effective basis, whether that means actual prosecutions or just moving cases or both. And I'll just throw it over to you.
All right. First, let me also point out that Mr. Jack Martin is also on the State Bar Committee, so it isn't just a prosecutor running the place. We've got defense attorneys on there as well.
Thank you for pointing that out.
I guess to start off with, let me start, even though there's some inconsistencies in the burglary sentencing part, there are some other issues there that cause a little bit of concern. You have now added elements that will be required to be accused or indicted and then be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. For example, you've got in there one of the requirements that for first degree it's got to be after sunset but before sunrise. When is that? We would have to prove that, and that may be a little difficult to prove. I don't think that the Farmer's Almanac has been recognized as a treaty that we can introduce into evidence just yet. Also, I would ask that you think about the individual who may be a nighttime worker who will be in his house during the daytime hours when a burglary occurs, and I know that that was one of the concerns about making it a nighttime burglary because that's when a house is normally occupied. But for somebody who works at night, he would be occupying that house during the daytime, and it wouldn't be between sunrise and sunset, or after sunrise and before sunset. I won't go into the punishment part because you've already mentioned that. But I will mention that a person convicted of first or second degree burglary, the way it's worded right now, will not be eligible for probation because you got in there that there is no
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
A person convicted of first or second degree burglary would not be sentenced to probation because you have that language in there that says no part of the sentence may be probated, suspended, or deferred. And I think that may go a little bit against some of the goals that I know the committee has. Let's see, it's somewhere around 318, 332, somewhere in that range. I don't have the exact line. I told Chairman Golick that unfortunately when I walked out of the house this morning, I left the notebook that I had made all my notes on, and so I'm having to do this from memory, and at my age, that's a difficult thing. Would you say, Chairman Willard? One other thing, when you've got in your theft provisions that you've made it a high and aggravated misdemeanor, you have raised the fine, but you haven't really done anything about the length of time that somebody will serve, other than you have made it go from the sheriff being able to give you 1 day for every day that you have served. He can only give you 4 days for every month that you serve. So somebody who had a 12-month sentence and got all of the good time credit under a regular misdemeanor, they would serve 6 months. Under a high and aggravated misdemeanor, you'll serve 10 months. And that will have an impact on the counties.
Let me address that a little bit, and not so much as a response. That there's and I just want to make sure, and I don't know if there's a representative from the Sheriff's Association here or not, and that's a good catch, and we appreciate it. Part of the intent there was to attempt. It's a recognition of the fact that as we go ahead and raise the thresholds on some misdemeanors, on felonies, you're necessarily, and we'll hear more about this from the Retail Association tomorrow, that these organized theft syndicates will go ahead and steal to the line, but they won't go over. They've got 3 or 4 grunts going in the mall or wherever, and they'll steal to the line. What we're attempting to do, and perhaps not doing successfully, was to, where we could, provide a mechanism for a higher fine in recognition of the fact that you're necessarily going to have more of these people being tried in state court and therefore spending more time in the local jail. That increases cost. I hear from our Sheriff Neil Warren every year, and he's absolutely right, that it costs about, what, $52, $53 a day approximately, and of course the state contribution of that is only $25 or less. So when it's in recognition of the fact that we know that there's going to be a higher cost, we have a responsibility, I think, just speaking for myself, to do what we can to provide some sort of mechanism to recover some of that cost, perhaps in the context of a higher fine. Is it an offset? No. And the short answer is I don't know. I can't imagine that it would be, but at least it's something, it's a recognition that we get it, and it'll allow the counties to go ahead and get more revenue in, potentially, to put toward that added jail cost. That was the intent. I don't know if that actually was executed well.
Well, you did.
But that is the intent.
Yeah, by making it a high and aggravated, you raise the potential fine from $1,000 to $5,000.
Right.
But with that goes additional time in the jail as well.
Right. So that's a balance we're going to have to strike.
In one of the Senate's provisions in the theft statutes, we have a little concern and would ask you to think about that individuals who have stolen small amounts of money, restitution can be ordered and they will have time to pay for it. But if they have stolen large amounts of money, having the time to reimburse or pay the restitution is going to be difficult within some of the time periods that you've specified in the statute. I've just got to ask.
How long would that take, if you don't mind me?
Well,
in general, I know that every case is different, but what have you seen, again, just from your experience?
Generally, most of the time, at least in my circuit in Cobb County, if a judge is ordering somebody to pay more than $200 a month, that's generally unusual because the people that we deal with on a regular basis do not have a great deal of assets. Most of the cases that we prosecute have court-appointed attorneys because they don't have enough assets. As a condition of probation, they're required to get a job, and then they're required to pay restitution. If they don't get a job, that truly is a violation of probation because that's something that they could do. Even though I know unemployment is high, there are still jobs out there if you want to go dig a ditch or do some of the really bad work that people don't like to do. But when it comes to restitution, if they don't pay, then we have to have a hearing on whether or not they have the ability to pay. And that becomes a little more difficult. And so the shorter period you give us, the greater the dollar amount that they're going to have to pay in order to get restitution paid within that time, which means it'll have an impact on us through the probation hearings, and then we'll have to prove whether or not they had the ability to pay. This is just a personal thing that I'm looking at, and I know where it came from, but having to prove $333.34 may be just a little difficult. If I prove 33 cents, it isn't going to make it, so I would like for y'all to sort of round that off a little bit. That would be helpful.
Point well taken.
In the forgery section, there were some discussions with us, and we're not really, I guess, sure about why there is a distinction between some documents and a check. It also appears that the way the statute is written right now, at least in this bill, that it eliminates the possession being a crime, the possession of a forged document, which in current language is second-degree forgery. But the possession, and I know that one of the prosecutors, one of the district attorneys talked about in his circuit, there were people who actually did generate a great deal of forged checks, but then they got other people to go out and try to, that is, utter or deliver, that is, try to cash them. But if we caught him under the way it's drafted right now, there would be very little that we could do because that's been eliminated under the current wording. In the drug section, you've started, in the bill at least, the language is being used that has previously not been used in Georgia, and that is the adulterant or dilutant. And in the past, what we have used is mixture.
Mixture.
And we would suggest to the committee that look at using mixture because we already have significant case law on that issue. If we change the terms, then we're going to have to redefine the terms, and that generally has to go through a process of appeals. The weight-based prosecution, I know that you talked to Director Keenan about that. We also have some concerns of the stress that it would put on the crime lab and the backlog that it would create for us. Right now, we actually do have people who will plead guilty to the possession because they know what they had, and they'll do that before we get the crime lab report back. The crime lab established a system several years ago so that if that occurs, we can go online and notify them so that they can take that testing out of their process and cut down on some of the drugs that they have to test. If we go to a weight-based prosecution, as Director Keenan said, there is a problem with having to test every bag that is found, but there's also a problem with prosecution. If we have somebody that is found to be, say, in a house or in a car, and on his person is a bag of a small amount of drugs, and then we find other bags located within close proximity to him, I don't have to be too concerned about the other bags because I've got enough to prosecute him on just what's on his person. If it's weight-based, then I'm going to have to take into consideration all the other bags that were close to him, and then I've got problems with equal access and other evidentiary problems that may be presented. So I would just ask you to consider all of that, the problems that it will place upon prosecution for a weight-based. In our discussions yesterday, when some of the prosecutors met, most everybody was in agreement, and I'm not speaking for the association, only those that were there yesterday, which included David McDade, by the way, that a sentence process, what's the right word, reoccurring sentencing would be a better method. That is, a first offense would carry a 1 to 2, a second offense would carry maybe a 1 to 5, a third offense might be graduated up a little higher, but it wouldn't be weight-based, which would eliminate the problems with the crime lab, and it would eliminate some of our evidentiary problems as well. In the part about Schedule 3, 4, and 5 offenses and cutting the time there, we would ask that you consider drug court and the length of time they're going to be needed because, as the director told you, prescription drugs are right up in the top 3 abuses, and alprazolam is a Schedule 3 drug. So that a lot of the prescription drugs are affected by that, and those are some of the people that need to be in drug court, and we need to have ample time to get them through the process.
Let me back up a second, because you're going from section to section, and we appreciate that because it does help give us some direction on where we need to go ahead and potentially make some changes. But if I see a question come in, it's going to be on I want it to be asked when it's fresh.
That's fine.
So let me recognize Chairman Neal.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Look, if you don't mind, if you could expand just a little bit on talking about the weight and preference for going from weight to first, second, third offense. Could you expand a little bit on how you envision that?
Well, let's say that you do, let's forget weight for a second. Mm-hmm. If you do it based upon the offenses that occur, because at least in my circuit, somebody who's in possession of drugs, unless it's with intent to distribute or unless it's a sale, first offense, he's not going to jail. Second offense, he probably isn't going to jail. With some judges, third offense, he's not going to jail. But the length of time that they are given for their offenses increases a little bit. They're put on probation for longer periods of time. I don't recall ever having a case that was a first offense that they got 15 years probation. So if you were to limit that, that would also limit the amount of time that could be revoked if they do violate again, which is what I believe the Pew report showed was causing some of the first offense drug cases going into the prison system. So if you were to say that a first offense would only be punished by 1 to 3, for example, then you have eliminated the possibility of that person ending up in prison beyond 3 years.
And whether it's a gram or 27 grams?
Wouldn't make any difference.
Okay.
As it is today, it doesn't make any difference for us, which is also why if it's weight-based and I've got multiple bags around, then I've got to decide, am I going to charge him with possession of more than 4 grams or more than 14 grams? And I don't have to worry about those decisions if it's sentence-based or recidivist-based.
I think this is an incredibly important piece of testimony right here because this is where the rubber hits the road, I think. And so what I'm hearing is, and I understand you're speaking only for yourself right now, but as a practical matter, if we were, we're trying to, again, strike that balance. Part of the core mission here is to spend dollars more wisely. And if certain individuals on the possession side aren't going to go to jail anyway, why have a situation where you have a 1 to 5 situation or more where they go ahead and get revoked and potentially go back in for longer? That's occupying, nonviolent, going back into a system where occupying a bed that needs to be occupied by someone else who's a threat to society. If I hear you correctly, the preference may be, and we'll hear from others as well, that rather than going to weight-based, potentially go ahead and reduce the sentencing time on those first and second offenses on the possession piece. Makes it less complicated on, for all the weight issues that we've heard, both from the director and from you, but also still accomplishing criminal justice economics that we're trying to go ahead and get to. I think that's incredibly important.
I think if you give prosecution a choice between the two, they'll take the recidivist type, where it's first, second, or third offense, and increasing the punishment rather than the weight-based. Weight-based is also going to increase our workload because there are going to be more motions. If I was a defense attorney and we're in a weight-based system, I'm going to be filing motions challenging the weight, the way it was done, challenging whether one bag, if that would make a difference, was actually something that could have been an equal access bag as opposed to something that I had control over. So I think it'll increase the workload for us.
If we were going to go ahead and adopt, let's say for a first possession, the 1 to 2 or the 1 to 3,
remember to give the judges the opportunity to give him a long enough sentence to get him through drug court.
Right. That's my concern, because what I've heard from, and I heard from the judges this morning about, what's the average? Well, it may be 18 months. Well, if it's 18 months, that's probably if they're a star student, right? If I had to take a guess.
Well, the program in Cobb is 18 months, but very few ever make it through 18 months. Most of them make it between 20 and 24.
I mean, as a practical matter, if you want to go ahead and shorten up on the time, give them every opportunity to succeed in a drug court program, and avoid the complications of a weight-based system, it would seem to me that you've got to have at least a 2-year opportunity.
You do.
And so if you did stick with the 1 to 2, it gives you at least that it gives the judge that discretion. You're a good drug court candidate. And without getting into the low risk, medium risk to high risk conversation, let's just say that, that first possession or second possession, if it's under a gram or whatever it is, if they're a good candidate, that we'd be comfortable with a 1 to 2.
Some of the judges may ask that you think about maybe 1 to 3 from the standpoint of they might like to watch the individual for some period of time after they have completed, so that they can determine if in fact it worked. I don't know of a better way to say it. But if it was like 1 to 3, then they could put them on probation for 3 years. If they successfully complete the program, then they would still have a little bit of time left to say, all right, now go out in society without having the daily or weekly meetings that we're having right now, and let's see how you really perform.
And it would still, as a practical matter, from a cost standpoint, be more efficient rather than having the 1 to 5. They come back, the 1 to 5, they're on probation, they violate, they're revoked for the balance, then they're in the system for another 3-4 years or whatever it is.
Correct.
That's that cycle that we're trying to avoid.
And I don't know if Mr. Connor's still here, but based upon pickup times, the sheriff tells me on somebody who's been revoked that the state should pick up, if they only have 8 to 10 months left, the chances are they're going to serve that in the county jail rather than in the state penitentiary.
Oh, I see. Ms. Randall.
Mr. Chairman, I think some of my question was answered because I was wanting clarity about like when you said that if you picked up someone and they had drugs on them, but what were you saying about drugs like in the vicinity, maybe perhaps something that they may have thrown?
Not necessarily thrown, but let's just say a car. You could have it on your person in the console next to you and maybe in the floorboard in the passenger side.
Okay.
If you're weight-based, then I'm going to have to try and prove all of that was under his control and nobody else's. If I'm under what we are today, which is just possession of less than 28 grams, unless it's with intent to distribute, the fact that he had it on his person is the only bag I've got to worry about, and the only bag that's going to be tested by the crime lab. They won't have to test the other two because I don't need them. Okay. I can still prosecute him for possession for the one bag that was on his person.
Okay, and in follow-up, and with going to you said 1 to 3, like for the first offenders. So if one, I heard that one of the judges said that their drug court program was 24 months, maybe? Did I hear that right?
I think Judge Bagley said his was 24 months.
So in order to do that, you would just have to extend the time to cover that, so it would have to be no less than 24 months or whatever the amount of time that program?
It would, but if the sentence, if you had a range of 1 to 3 for a first offense, then the judge could give him 3 years probation. Okay. And he could even say either terminated or whatever how he wanted to word it upon successful completion. If he does complete it within those 24 months, then that gives the judge an opportunity to at least watch him in the community when he's not coming back in on a regular basis to talk to the judge and the counselors. During the drug court program, they are meeting with the drug court judge personally, and they're also meeting with their counselors on a regular basis. When they graduate, that stops. And I think most judges would like to have the opportunity to see how they perform in society without those continuous meetings, because it varies from a week to twice a month to once a month as they get closer to the end.
So am I to conclude that that your opinion is that it would be more efficient for us to do it that way rather than to go to a weight base?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Because it ultimately accomplishes the same end, but in a much less complicated procedure as it relates to the weight base, and plus you avoid the backup, the backlog. If I'm
That's correct.
Okay, Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm intrigued by that. You got my attention, and I'm trying to think this through. And the thing that comes to my mind, and one thing I think is important for everybody to understand about me is I'm not ingrained. I don't have ingrained in me what I think is the best approach. I was the lock 'em up guy, and I had a personal experience in my life dealing with people who came to my church that. And watching what was happening in their lives and seeing some of these that are the second and third and fourth offense people that were in a treatment program. I pastored a church of about 60 people, had about 20 or 30 men from a nearby recovery residence that started attending my church. And in watching them and seeing their struggles with their addiction, I began to have some real conflicts internally between my belief that we have to punish these addicts until they get the message, and then seeing in them what I saw there didn't fit with my beliefs. So about 7 years ago, I started doing a lot of exploration and really digging into the science of addiction and what's going on in the lives of these addicts and why they're struggling so much with their addiction. So I've laid aside all of my preconceived ideas to try to be open to data and open to evidence-based and science-based and to really, so I'm intrigued by that. But the thing that concerns me about it is this, and I think it was Judge Bagley that talked about the difference between high risk and high needs.
Correct.
And how the high needs individual is the one that's that serious addict that you keep seeing reoffending. And that low risk, high needs individual is the one who probably more than any other needs a accountability court or some type of something to address that addiction. And my concern is when we see them coming back in for the third and fourth time, what we really are seeing is this is the classic high needs case, and my concern is we're going to take if we do this and hey, I'm open. I want to talk about it because I'm intrigued by it. But so I'm kind of thinking out loud, I guess. But my concern is if we take and start raising that bar with those needs-based people that are coming back, we're going to end up with individuals incarcerated based primarily on the high need, regardless of what the risk is. And I think every study that I've seen shows that prison is the worst place for those offenders. It's an expensive way to try to deal with them, and almost inevitably they come back out still with just as much of a need as they ever had previously to going in prison. So my initial thoughts and caution on that is we really need to be careful that we don't begin treating the high needs person as somebody that we're afraid of and need to lock up, and be careful that we don't create legislation based on how many times they've been caught with drugs to where we're starting to direct more and more of those into the prison system.
Just thinking out loud
Yeah.
in response to that, perhaps there could be some consideration given to rewarding an individual for successfully completing his drug court program, even though he may have been looking at a 5th or 6th offense, which could have been a 2 to 15, but if he successfully completes the program, that would substantially reduce the sentence.
Okay, I want to look at this more. I want to look at this more. I'm interested, but I do. In doing so, I want to make sure we're careful that we're really paying attention to the needs part and the low risk, high needs offenders.
I think what if I am understanding this conversation, just because we're looking at, let's say, a first or second time offender, the low weight, first or second time offender caught with next to nothing. Just because we're looking at them in terms of a 1 to 3 as opposed to a larger sentence, that's not precluding someone who may be a repeat offender, but who still may be a good candidate for a drug court program. It's not an A or B conversation. You have the possibility still of having a repeat offender who's got a history from here to the floor, but from what the judges said earlier, may be at that rock bottom stage and may be mature enough and ready for a drug court program, even though what they're picked up for at that point, depending on their record and the drug and and whatever it is, would still have them being incarcerated for X amount of time. It's still a range. It's still 1 to something, right? It's still 1 to whatever it ends up being in this bill, and it still doesn't preclude them from being in a drug court program. So the discretion would still be there. The question is how far is the range?
Well, right now, it ranges for the first offense from 1 to 15, but the second offense goes, if I'm not mistaken, to 2 to 30, and that's a big jump.
Another thing that I think is important too is when we look at what the council is looking for is how can we efficiently and effectively handle these low level offenders in a way that gives them the best opportunity to be productive members of society, saving those corrections dollars so that we can handle those that we're afraid of better and more effective. And I think we did some things here to increase on some of those that we're afraid of. And also so that we can have the funds that we need to be able to take care of community corrections and community-based services. And I also want to, with that thought in mind, make sure that we don't get into the mindset where we're thinking about with drug offenders, it's either drug court or prison, because there are a lot of other things that can be effective in treating those offenders. Community-based supervision with 12-step meetings and a counselor that they meet periodically. There are other more efficient ways that you can effectively handle some of those offenders. So let's be careful that we don't begin to look at either drug court or prison and rule out other options too.
But, at the risk of beating a dead horse, let me just make sure I'm clear that the only thing that I think the only path that I think we're going down right now is, as opposed to going to a more complicated weight-based system that we may not have to do, why not look at, we can achieve the same ends while still maintaining discretion and public safety by simply addressing that through the sentencing range. as opposed to weight. That's all. And that's not throwing water on your repeat offender, the higher need individual. It's just if we can do it simpler through the sentencing ranges as opposed to complicating it in the backlog and all the administrative issues it'll cause for the prosecutors and for the court system in general, not to mention the increased funding, which we're trying to save, why not do it just through the sentencing range? And I'm not saying that in terms of that's what we should do. I'm just saying that that's the path that we're on right now in this conversation in order to get away from the complications. Keep it simple as you can. It's not simple. But if we can simplify it somewhat by getting away from weight and getting toward the same goal that you and I both share, but through a less complicated system that focuses just on the sentencing range, why not? That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and I'm interested in that conversation. But I want to see, we need to look at data. But I'm interested in that conversation. Absolutely.
Moving on to the next section, somewhere around line 18 to 1820 some odd is a mention of probation and some of the things that go on with probation. And because of some changes that have occurred in there, it now gives the judge an opportunity for an ex parte hearing about terminating probation. It also gives the right to file a motion to terminate probation without the prosecuting attorney being involved. I would ask that you consider keeping the prosecutor intern because we may have information that may not be available to a judge who would be making that decision.
Could you tell us again where you are?
Somewhere between 1818 and 1822,
okay.
Beginning in that range.
Thank you.
The prosecutors from yesterday and the PAC put together a memorandum basically on the things that I've been talking about, and I think we gave copies to somebody. Chuck?
Yeah, we've got the review and comments.
Okay, yeah. Where I am right now is number 12 on that list, which is page 7 of 10. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I think that's the majority of what I consider the bigger items that at least concern me individually. There is one other. I know it's a housekeeping matter. It's just a cleanup and it's an oversight. But just so we don't forget that under the bill as it stands now, possession of less than 4 grams of heroin is not a crime. So we need to be sure and put that back in somewhere.
Count on it.
But
Mr. Neal.
Just and wheel's still turning. When we're talking about possession offenders only, would there be a willingness for possession offenders to only be given treatment, or if it gets to that point, drug court options, or possibly an RSAT or day reporting center or something along those lines, rather than a prison sentence, since we know that prison doesn't work for them?
Personally, well, let me start off by giving a legal definition.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever a judge sentences somebody and puts them on probation, that is a prison sentence. And he is allowed to serve it outside the walls of the prison by being under rules and conditions that he must meet. Personally, I don't have a problem with trying to direct somebody to correct their life with drug abuse any way we can do that, because I agree with what the judges said. That ultimately reduces crime. the problem for a lot of prosecutors is, what do you do with somebody who really doesn't want to take advantage of the opportunities you've given them time and time and time again, and they keep going back out and violating the law and really just don't care? And unfortunately, there are a good number of people who just don't care.
One of the things, and I think, yeah, that's, you're going to have some folks like that. There's a wide spectrum when you're talking about offenders, but when you're talking even about those repeat offenders that keep coming back to you, the most expensive thing we can do with them is send them to prison. And we know that sending them to prison almost guarantees that they're going to come back out and go to drug. I mean, study after study after study shows that if we send them to prison, we almost guarantee that they're going to come back and go back to their drug use. And I know that sometimes it just, you may have somebody go through treatment even 2 and 3 and 4 times, and then finally they get it. I'm just wondering if there are other ways that are less expensive and more effective for those offenders than just saying we're going to give you so many opportunities and then you're going to prison. It's like saying we're going to give you so many opportunities to be successful, and then we're going to do the most expensive thing that we can to ensure that you're not successful.
Wouldn't it also be advantageous, though, for consideration to be given to having some type of treatment program within prison?
Well, that's what the RSAT is, and I am a huge fan of RSAT, and I'm excited that we've got 600 new RSAT beds coming online.
And that would certainly address that. But I think from the court's perspective, at least from prosecution, most of the DAs that I know do try to do everything they can to keep somebody from, even though the defense doesn't always agree with us, we do everything we can to try to keep them from going to prison. That's not what we want. What we want is a rehabilitated offender who's going to be a good serving member of society. That's the desire.
Excellent.
But at a certain point, you've got to do something to punish somebody just for the fact that they won't comply with the rules of society. And there is an end, just like with, I'm sure, raising your children. You did graduated or do graduated punishments with them. Mine are all grown. But I did graduated punishments with them until there was an end when I wore their bottom out.
I've been there too, by the way. Here's my concern with that. We learned a long time ago, hundreds of years ago, you can throw water on a fire and put a fire out. And somewhere along the line, there was a fire that somebody threw water on, and it got worse. And they went, what happened with that? We eventually found out that, well, that was a grease fire, and you can't throw water on a grease fire. It causes a real problem when you throw water on a grease fire. So we've all learned that you can't do that now. We learned hundreds and hundreds of years ago that punishment corrects bad behavior. And I got my share growing up. I grew up in a home where I was told when I went to school, if you get busted at school, you get busted at home.
I have an older brother. I got 2 shares.
So we all understand that. But one thing that we've learned over the last 10 to 20 years is we've gotten more technology, more advanced technology to truly be able to understand addiction, the brain scans where you can see what's happening with the brain. There's no question that these addicts are suffering from a disease. And when we're trying to treat that disease and we're having relapse, and relapse is part of treatment for addiction, when we're trying to treat that disease and we're having relapse, if we ever get to the point that we think the best thing now is to punish the behavior, we've just thrown water on a grease fire. Because as soon as we start trying to punish the addiction away, we're punishing a disease that we know putting them in prison causes them to come out still addicted, but now they've got criminal mindset that they learned in prison that they never had. Now, I'm not talking about RSAT. I'm talking about behind the walls of prison. All right, and we know we know it's not an opinion. It's not a hypothesis. It's not what we think happens. We know it happens most of the time, and I don't. You know, I don't know where we fall here, but I do know this: if it's somebody that's not a threat to society, and the crime is addiction-driven crime, we need to be doing everything we can not to put them in prison, to give them a graduate degree in crime so they can come out and be a threat to society. That's
I got to respectfully disagree, and that is because somebody who is a repeat offender over and over again, if their addiction has gotten that bad, they're a threat to me. They're a threat to me personally. Many of the murders that we have are committed by people who are drug addicts. The aggravated assaults, the burglaries in the home, those are people that I am afraid of. And if we keep letting people who are addicted to drugs not have to face any serious consequence for that addiction, they will, in my humble opinion, they will ultimately hurt somebody.
And I think that's where the risk needs assessment comes in, because we begin to we can begin to see when they start trending toward true criminal behavior to be afraid of. We can typically see that.
I haven't seen the assessment that'll give me that information yet. I would be happy to do that. If we could we start giving it in high school?
Middle school or maybe late elementary school.
Let me ask you a question about the recidivist statute. Judge Weaver, I should have mentioned this before. Let me give you a fair warning that you're in the on-deck circle if you want to be in the on-deck circle. I know you've traveled to be here, so I'll think about that, and if you would like to come up, we'd love to have you as soon as Mr. Head is done with his testimony.
I am learning and listening and would be glad to answer any question, but I think the 4 judges that spoke this morning did an excellent job, but I certainly will be glad to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, ma'am.
I would never want to argue at this point in time with a man I've known for a long time, Mr. Hart.
Thank you. Thank you. That makes 2 of us. Indeed. Considerably.
Sometimes other comments can be made from the audience later. So,
let me ask you about the recidivist statute. I just want to make sure I've got clarity, and it may help the committee too. We have the recidivist statute for possession crimes, correct?
We do.
Okay. To what? And this may be a question that's better directed to the corrections department. I don't know, but to what extent is the use of the recidivist statute on the possession side, I'll call it, jamming up our prisons, as opposed to use of the recidivist statute on the selling trafficking side, which is a whole other conversation, I think, amongst folks up here. But on the possession side, we're curious to know, and you may not know, how that's working in terms of the jail population, because that's a real stinger, isn't it, in terms of
I can
time.
only speak to Cobb again, and that is a second offense possession case, as I mentioned earlier. He's not going to get the maximum sentence, and he's not going to prison. He's going to be on probation again. We really do try to do everything we can to help somebody if they are willing to accept the help.
When does the recidivist statute kick in for?
Well, technically, when it's a second offense, that's a recidivist because it goes from 15 to 30. And that, as I mentioned, that's a big jump, and that's why I think most of the prosecutors would be willing to look at changing that sum and bringing it down to a first offense would be some sentence, a second offense would be some sentence, a third offense. And if the committee would like, I'm sure I could get with some of the members of the prosecuting community and come up with some suggestion that we'd be glad to share with you.
We would welcome that, and this is not information for you to gather, it's for us to gather about how I would be interested to know how the use of the recidivist statute statewide, if that can even be measured, if it has been measured, what does that mean in terms of the number of nonviolent drug offenders in the state system right now? What is that? I'm sure that probably exists somewhere. I just don't know.
I know there's some other prosecutors who have signed up to speak to the committee, and I'm sure that, I don't know if Mr. McDade or some of the others may be able to at least speak to their circuit, if not some of the other circuits.
Sure, and I know everybody is myopic to their own circuit, and rightly so. But we're trying to take a look at it in the statewide prison system, and that again goes to that vicious cycle on the possession side that we're all passionate about to varying degrees.
Can I follow up?
Let me recognize Mr. Weldon, and then we'll come back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you being here. At what point on the possession, if you've got serial possession convictions, at what point do you feel like that would be something that needs to be addressed when it hasn't reached into the trafficking mode?
You mean my personal opinion when somebody ought to go to prison because they just won't stop possessing drugs?
Yes, sir.
For me, it would be somewhere in the 4 to 5 range.
And could you just address, based on your experience in Cobb, the impact that those serial possession type offenders have on spreading that to other individuals?
I really can't speak to that. All I know is that if somebody continually possesses, and we have seen them with 2 or 3 possessions, then it is not long before we see them committing other crimes as well. And that goes to what I think Judge Bagley was talking about, the addiction as opposed to the abuse. He may have started off as an abuser, but he eventually, or she, became addicted and then couldn't fund the addiction, so then they resort to other crimes in order to fund that addiction.
Thanks, sir. And if I could, Mr. Chairman, I'm an attorney in Ringgold, Georgia, and it's very close to the border of Tennessee and Georgia. And what I have seen numerous times, we have people coming from Tennessee that are charged with a crime in Georgia, a drug crime, possession, trafficking, that type of issue, or manufacturing. And when they come out of Tennessee, and they come to Georgia, they come to Lookout Mountain Judicial Circuit or the Consaga or one of the other districts there. And I'm representing someone, and I look them in the eye and say, look, if you get convicted, particularly by a jury, you are going to serve time in prison. And they've been involved in several convictions in Tennessee. They've always what they call paper, or they've always had probation. Right. They look at me in shock, and I look back at them with this concern about this is what you're charged with, and this is what you could potentially get. I'm concerned a little bit about the perception that Georgia courts could obtain similar to the Tennessee courts. If people have a perception that, well, if I get caught, I'm just going to get probation. And I think that there is a long way we can go toward addressing the issue of rehabilitating the high needs folks that are sick and tired of being sick and tired. I'm concerned about our courts and our prosecuting ability could be compromised. And I'm not real sure how to make that balance work, and I'd just like to hear your comment on something like that.
Representative Weldon, I'm not really sure how to do that either. I do know you mentioned one thing, though, and I will clarify maybe what I said earlier about probation for Cobb. And this is during my time as a defense attorney as well, and I probably handled cases in 30 or so counties within this state. I found out that judges are much more willing to go along with a recommendation from the prosecuting attorney, whether it be a solicitor general or district attorney, if an individual is willing to admit their guilt and say they're wrong and accept responsibility. I have some judges in Cobb County who, if you insist that you are not guilty and go for a trial, they do not reward you for accepting responsibility because you didn't. And therefore, you most likely will end up going to prison. And that is I think a lot of judges in that state or in this state have that attitude of, you want to. If after I've heard all the evidence, there is no doubt in my mind that you were guilty and you knew you were guilty, I'm not going to reward you. And the same as I would somebody who came in and admitted their guilt and accepted their responsibility. So yeah, after a trial, you would probably go to jail in Cobb County as well for a second possession. But as far as you said, doing the paper, I don't want any circuit to get a reputation of being soft on crime. I don't think we in Cobb have that reputation. But I think we do have a reputation of trying to work with people to the best of our ability. Our drug court, run by Judge Krager, is a very exceptional court, I think. And when I was asked if I would work with the Superior Court judges in that and help them with it, in fact, Judge Krieger says my response was, what took you so long? Chairman Neal, when you were talking about earlier, let's see, when you forgot my train of thought. I turned around and I was looking at him, and all it took was turning my head.
I think this goes back to Judge Weaver's comment of earlier, but
I will tell you, sitting here and answering questions
Easy
is
for me to
far
say.
different than standing somewhere else and asking questions.
it is. It is much safer over here. It is much safer, I have to admit. You're right. I'm sorry, Mr. Weldon.
Well, I appreciate your comment on that. That concerns me about that, because there's different expectations, and when you have different expectations by defendants, then I think I have the impression that organized crime has different approaches in Tennessee than it does in Georgia, and that's a real live example that I've experienced. And I think when we're talking about drug crimes, many times it's related to organized crime.
I can tell you that at least in Cobb, possession is treated entirely different than possession with intent, and the policy in my office for a sale of drugs goes together with jail. Sale is jail.
And I want to compliment you on your prosecutorial discretion. That is a good demonstration of the way to address that. Thank you.
Mr. Neal.
You mentioned the fourth or fifth offense before they go to prison. If you could, when an offender comes to you on a first offense, I'm assuming it's probation and supervision. Can you talk to me a little bit about what happens with that offender on that first offense?
And also let me mention that the fourth or fifth, I'm not talking about occurring during the same period of probation, because I don't have any control over what a judge is going to do.
Right.
I'd make a recommendation, but if you violate your probation, the judge is most likely going to put you somewhere for a period of time. Anyway, back to the about what we do with the first person. Put them.
Yes.
Generally, they are required to get some type of drug assessment, and if there's a recommendation of treatment, that they follow up on treatment, and that's at their own expense while they're on probation.
Or do they complete that treatment usually, or?
If they don't, then the probation officer will bring or should bring them back before the court for a violation of probation.
Okay. Second offense, same basic.
Generally, we give them the chance all over again.
Do you feel like that? Do you feel like those community services, the community supervision with probation, and the community services that are available to your offenders, do you feel like that they're sufficient for the offenders? I tell you what. I'm not asking you that question. I would draw my question, Your Honor.
I don't want to offend anybody.
Hey, let me tell you one of the things the reason I was going there, because I'm going to say it without offending anybody. I think I'm chairman of the Department of Corrections, and I want to say that I believe, and the director of probation is here, and he's my constituent, so.
And I consider him a friend, but
yeah, and I'm going to say this, and I don't think you would disagree with me. Probation doesn't do the job we need them to do.
I would agree with that.
And it's not their fault.
I would agree with that as well. They don't have the resources.
It's our fault. We with the policy that we have in place in the state of Georgia, we've set up a system that is doomed to fail. And we've done that because we're putting $1 billion a year in corrections. We've done that because we're spending so much money incarcerating people that we don't have the money to staff your office the way it needs to be staffed. We don't have enough money to staff probation the way they need to be staffed. We don't have enough money to do community-based services that need to be done. And the biggest driver of that prison cost is individuals that need treatment more than incarceration anyway. And the council, John Spear with Applied Research here, and I think here in Atlanta, does a great job. He works with EPB, OPB, corrections and probation and parole, I think, and does their numbers with projections of if we don't do anything, if we just allow things to continue the way they are, we're gonna see another $250 million, according to the council report, in correction spending in the next 5 years, with a prison population pushing 60,000. we already, as far as our rate, we already have the highest rate of individuals per capita incarcerated. We're continuing to drive that money into corrections. And what we have to do, and what the council was assigned to, was look for ways that we can more efficiently and effectively deal with these low-level offenders, so that we can take some of that corrections dollars that we're going to have to be spending, and we can make sure, and it's part of the bill, that we can make sure that probation has the resources they need so that they can utilize evidence-based probation services to give those offenders that are first and second offense a better chance of not becoming the third offender. And I think as we go through this process, one of the things that we have to remember is this is a broad approach that envelops an awful lot of pieces, and all of those pieces are important for us to get to the whole. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember. And hey, I know you guys are doing a great job following the policy that we've laid out for you, and we appreciate that. We just realize now that the policy that we've set over the last 20 years is the most expensive way to treat these low-level offenders, and the least effective way at the same time. And we owe it to taxpayers, and we owe it to the offenders to look for the efficient, effective way to handle these low-level offenders, and give you all the opportunity to do what we need you to be doing. But, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be quiet for a minute. I've talked too much.
No, it's just fine. Mr. Weldon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to make this my last question. Can you just articulate to us the deterrent factor that the specter of going to prison has on people that are out there, and they have they have to look at they consider the deterrent, or consider what they could lose if they are caught with and convicted of possession of one of these drugs.
If I was in charge, I don't know that I would send somebody to prison as the first opportunity to lose their freedom. There are many people, especially some of the younger ones, who I believe it would have an impact on them to spend 30, 60, or 90 days in custody rather than going from probation to prison. And on most felonies, that's generally where you end up, is one or the other. And perhaps the committee could find some way to give judges and prosecutors the ability, or at least encourage them to use abilities to, I guess the phrase is shock treatment. We used to have a shock incarceration program years ago. We used to have a Zip 6 program years ago. And some of those programs were not bad. Armed robbery was for a youthful offender, is what the Zip 6 was, 0 to 6 sentence. And there was a training system that they went through, an educational system, and when they successfully completed that, whether it be in 1 year or 2 years, they got out. And if they didn't, they stayed there until they did, up to 6 years. I would suggest maybe the committee should go back and look at that for some of the youthful offenders. I thought it was a good program. But I think if we use the jails, even though I know it overburdens the counties, and use them more efficiently so that we are incarcerating somebody to get their attention, because that's really what we want to do, then I think that might have an impact. But that's just my personal opinion.
I see no further questions. Mr. Head, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very helpful. We really appreciate it. Mr. McDade, let me ask you, you're here on behalf of the DA Association, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, welcome.
With the chairman's permission, could I bring a couple other folks?
Sure, that'd be fine. And Mr. Head, thank you, and I think Chuck Olson, you referenced as well. Thank you for your review and comments on 1176. This will help us on especially the technical gaps. Welcome. You know, we have one microphone there, so I don't know how that's going to work with 3 prosecutors. That's just,
We can share.
Can you? All right. Just do the best you can. We appreciate your taking the time to give us your perspective. Really, it's the same ask of all the other witnesses. I mean, it would let us know what you see as issues. We do have your written comments on some of the technical gaps, that some of which we're aware of, some of which we're not aware of. Those are very fixable, as they are in any 75-page or more bill, as it goes through the substitute process. But really talking about things, high-level structural issues. Obviously, you heard Mr. Head's comments about, I think, it was all very helpful, but the big takeaway from me was, and perhaps for other members of the committee as well, had to do with, as opposed to going to a weight-based system, looking at the sentences with a fresh set of eyes to see where we can be a little smarter on that in terms of the sentencing range, but not wanting to take away, to go to the dialogue that he had with Mr. Weldon just a minute ago, not to take. There comes a point where you got a chance. What's that dividing line where you're just going to go to jail for X amount of time because you simply cannot get the hint, and a lot of that has to do with discretion. We understand that, where that line exists, what the ranges should be for the various offenses, and the various first, second, third time. And just your thoughts about that, which may be in alignment with Mr. Head's. It may be not. It may be a variation on that theme. We understand that. So I'll just give it over to you and whatever
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
you want to say.
And committee members, my name is David McDade. I am the district attorney from Douglas County, and I'm also the president of the District Attorney Association. This is Ken Malden. Ken Malden is the district attorney from Athens-Clarke County. He's also one of the co-chairmen of our legislative committee. And you all know Chuck Olson. He needs no introduction. And we appreciate this committee and the chairman and your work in listening to us. The Prosecuting Attorneys Council, primarily headed up by Mr. Olson and Mr. Gunner, and a group of prosecutors prepared basically the document you have, and I'm not going to go through that line by line, certainly. That's for you to read, and if you find guidance there, we hope it helps you. There were some boilerplate issues that I think are just drafting issues that I think this outlines for you. I would like to speak to a couple of broader issues, and then certainly the others will speak as well. One, I believe that Director Vernon Keenan made it very clear that there are certainly some fiscal issues that are going to be tied to going to a weight-based prosecution model. I think Mr. Head did a good job of explaining there's also going to be practical issues to going to a weight-based prosecution model. Mr. Chairman, you hit the nail on the head. You can achieve the same result without changing the prosecution model by adjusting the sentencing range. I think we would commit that to you as a more reasonable option that we would ask you to strongly consider. The devil's going to be in the details of what sentences and what sentences ranges that you find appropriate. That's a policy decision for you to reach. But as far as the two models, I would strongly encourage you to not change the way we prosecute cases, but look at adjusting the sentencing range. But having said that, I want to make it very clear. Drugs are not always victimless crimes. I want to be very careful in making certain that you understand, as Mr. Weldon said, there could be a perception created if we went to a sentencing model that was perceived as being less stringent or always invited only a probationary type sentence, that it would lose its deterrent effect. But it's a policy decision for the committee to reach. But I can tell you from personal experience that most homicides that I've prosecuted over 80, but most prosecutions for homicide in my circuit are driven by drugs. Most violent crime that I prosecute is drug involved. So just because a person possesses a drug, it's rarely just a victimless crime. Now, Representative Neal, I agree completely with your model when it comes to the drug addict. If it's a drug addict, that's a disease, that's a sickness, and we need to deal with that in a separate way. But a lot of people just abuse drugs. A lot of people take them recreationally. A lot of people, just while they're going to go burglarize a house, decide to get high, and that causes them to change their value system or their judgment thinking. And they commit drugs because they're using, they commit crime because they're using drugs, not because they're addicted. It's just part of the lifestyle. I would simply suggest that for those addicts, the approach you're describing is one that I think is very reasonable. There's a lot of folks out there that aren't addicts that come through the criminal justice system. And if I've got a repeat burglar or somebody that's committed aggravated assault a number of times and he's burglarized the home of my neighbor down the street for the second or third time, or he has committed a burglary for the second or third time, I'm going to be one of those DAs that's going to look at that victim and say, you're right. There's a place for that guy. And it's not in a drug court. It's not in a RSAT maybe. It may be in an RSAT, but it's not going to be, I'm going to give him probation if he's a career repeat offender. I think that we sacrifice public safety if we capture too many people in that umbrella. But for the addicts, I agree with you completely. I want to shift completely away from the drug issue if there's no questions on that issue.
Well, let me ask you a question. And Mr. Head alluded to it, and I think that there's a great dividing line in our society between possession and sale. And that, not to get cliche about it, but I heard, Mr. Head's comment, there's sale, there's jail. And, that's catchy, and just from a substantive standpoint, I happen to agree with that. I think and more importantly, I think my constituents agree with that. I think they get it on the possession side, the addict, the person who just has a huge problem, as opposed to someone who is corrupting others and doing it for profit. I think that's a great dividing line in terms of public opinion and local opinion at the Publix and Vinings and other places. So, but do you share that opinion from a reform standpoint?
I do, at least in my circuit. Your first sale generally brings a recommendation of 10 serve 3 for your first sale. If it's a sale, no matter if it's a small amount, we're starting at 10 serve 3. You're going to prison. You're going to see the inside of a jail if you're selling drugs. I would be run out of my circuit if people that are selling drugs are not dealt with in that regard. That's what my community expects. But if you're in the business of selling drugs, you may also be a drug abuser yourself. But if you're in the business of spreading drugs to other people, then I think, at least in the system in which I exist, the public expects that we deal with those more harshly than the simple possession cases.
Let's break that down a little bit more in terms of, if this is an industry, huge industry. We are unfortunately a hub, given the dynamics of where Atlanta is from a transportation standpoint. That's no secret. On the sale piece, from a cartel standpoint, from a syndicate standpoint, from an organizational standpoint, we all get it. Let's talk about the sale, and the distinction I'm trying to make, of course, is what I call the STM, the stupid teenage male, who, stupid teenage male, the contradiction in 3 terms, right? But let's just call it the stupid teenage male who goes ahead and sells something to a buddy of his. Is he a dealer? Maybe, maybe not. Is he, how is that, what I'm trying to figure out is how is that individual treated as someone who is selling drugs? And I realize that you have just your circuit. I get that. And Mr. Head has the Cobb circuit. How is that individual generally, and Mr. Weldon and others who practice in this area can certainly, hopefully, chime in about it. How is that individual treated in the system as opposed to your big-time seller? Where are the distinctions, if you can speak to that? I understand it's a local thing.
Sure. Certainly, if it's the stupid teenager, the conversation starts at 10 serve 3, and based upon the facts that exist in the case, alternative sentencing options come into play quite regularly. We're not going to treat the 17-year-old kid in the high school parking lot who sells his friend a joint for $2 the same way as the guy that we're running a wiretap on who's bringing in 5 pounds a week to give to the level above that kid to sell to that kid to sell to that kid. Mm-hmm. We're going to break it down, pour down in the facts, and deal with them, I think, the way the facts would direct that we do. We certainly look at the youthfulness of the offender. We certainly look at the circumstances. And the facts will pretty much lead us to the conclusion. If the information becomes that this young man, although he's 17 years of age, has been selling and been prosecuted in the juvenile court 2 or 3 times for that type of conduct, and we do a search warrant at his home and find, scales and baggies and a logbook where he's been making 200 sales a month and profiting, a couple $1,000s a week.
It's a business.
Yeah, it's a business. He earns higher scrutiny and higher punishment, hopefully, and I think that's what all prosecutors generally do.
Mr. Neal, did you have a question on that line?
It was exactly on that line, Mr. Chairman, and I want to take it just a step farther than you took it. The getting out of the 17-year-old on the with his buddy at high school, getting into the little bit older guy, and first of all, let me say this: I'm the anti-drug guy. I've never one time in my life been high. I'm that anti-drug guy. But I've dealt with a lot of people who aren't that guy. And I know the reality is it's not an uncommon thing for there to be that person among his friends that he's the one that goes and picks it up. And then 4 or 5 of them get together and they all use. And maybe the others cover all the cost and he gets his free, but he was the guy that picked it up. Is he a dealer because he's done that? Is that?
I think it would be fact specific in every case. If he's the guy that happens to go pick it up every week when they get together and happens to have the connection to the cartel supplied drugs, sure he is. If he's just happened to be the guy that has the fastest car and knows the directions to the guy's house he's going to buy it from, no, he's not going to be treated as a dealer, not at least in my circuit. It's fact driven.
Okay.
It should be.
And it's probably different. You're speaking for you. I'm sure it's
Yes.
different across the state. Okay. I just want to go a little further with it.
Sure.
Thanks
for responding to those questions. Please, I know you had other things to talk about.
The other area that I was going to speak to was the burglary proposal that's in and Mr. Head spoke to that briefly as well. I also had the pleasure of serving on the Criminal Justice Reform Council over the summer. I was one of the members appointed to that commission, and I can tell you that there was a lot of discussion about the burglary issue. The crime of burglary is a crime that hits every community in this state. It is a crime that affects, thousands of people, and it's a crime that, as a prosecutor, I hear about from the victim passionately. It's a crime that upsets people in their homes, in their communities. It's a crime that just makes people mad. If you've been the victim of a burglary, you understand that. And so, in the conversations over the summer with the council, I recommended, or I suggested, that for the residential burglary, that being a burglary of somebody's home, that you enhance the punishment. That's the crime that just drives so many people crazy, is being burglarized. So I suggested that we increase the punishment. This isn't a council whose recommendations were, let's figure out how we can keep everybody out of prison. Let's not get soft on crime, council. This was how do we improve the justice system. Well, that crime impacts everybody everywhere. So I suggested we increase the punishment. At the same time, recognizing that there should be consideration given to reducing punishment for the crime of burglary where it involves something other than a home. And so the model or the discussion and the conversation in the council became, okay, we should have a severe punishment range available for people that break into people's homes, and maybe something less severe for people who break into an outbuilding or a barn or a shed. I personally agree with that model. The proposal in the bill added aggravating circumstances before you can convict someone of first-degree burglary. I would suggest to you that those aggravating circumstances are going to be very difficult. They're not going to be able. They're going to lend themselves to many challenges. Pat's already alluded to that. Mr. Head's already alluded to that. When is sundown to sun up? Those are issues that just aren't really things that are easily established in court and will subject the prosecution to a number of crimes.
We're conceding the Farmer's Almanac situation, and your point, and seriously, your point's well taken on that. What I'm hearing more than anything is just simplify.
That's in one word, simplify. Okay. And the suggestion is make a residential burglary the maximum, the heightened punishment, and a non-resident burglary be something less, if that's the policy decision you reach, without all these qualifiers and that sort of thing. Just the KISS principle, if I might be so bold. And that would be the two bigger policy issues that I had asked to speak to. Now, Mr. Olson spearheaded the drafting of the document that you have with you, and he certainly can answer any questions about that. Mr. Malden is here as the named representative of the Legislative Affairs Committee for the DAs as well.
Questions from the committee, Mr. Weldon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. McDade. Gentlemen, appreciate you being here and appreciate you taking interest in this project. Without looking at the burglary statute that we have, and it's 1 to 20, if I'm not, the sentencing, just talking about sentencing, it's 1 to 20. We could leave the burglary statute the way it is and have another code section that says in the event there is a burglary of a person's home, and that's not refined language. A dwelling house, a dwelling place, I guess it'd need to be house. Then there would be a judge could have discretion to enhance the sentence for up to X amount of years. Is that where you're going with this?
You've captured the essence of what I'm saying. Under the current burglary statute, there's a definition of those places that can be burglarized, and that includes your home and then other buildings. So in the current law, burglary covers both scenarios. And I think what I hear you saying is you recognize that what we're suggesting is separate the two and give an enhanced punishment for the burglary of a home.
And yeah, right.
That's
okay.
what we're saying.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we've got two individuals who worked on the commission, Mr. McDade and Representative Neal. Who else in here, if anybody? I was not on. You were not on. Mr. Hamrick was on. Excuse me. Pardon me, Senator. What I'm looking back at, as I recall, what we were looking to have the commission do also was to address, firstly, I think we're trying to build a model here. And I know from what I've read and heard, there were other states that have gone through this and more or less had success in the way they've handled the changes of the approach to sentencing. Texas, Louisiana, South Carolina come to mind. And they seem to all work on a similar model with each other. Are we building something different? Are we drawing on the work and experience of those other states with what we're doing here? Or are we trying to do something different?
Chairman Willard, I do not know where the aggravating circumstances came from that are in the proposed burglary statute. I've never seen those before, and so I can't comment on whether or not they're coming from some other state's model. I don't believe that they are.
Did y'all receive information about what was done in, say, Texas as a means of what I hear being their success story and changing the way they did sentencing, probation, intensified probation, and in fact, what I hear is those states that lowered the crime rates even. I'm serious. Do we do something different in those states than what we're trying to do here?
I think the recommendations that were put forth by the Pew Foundation included some analysis of other states and what they had done. With all deference to Pew, we didn't always agree in the prosecution community with Pew's research, and we specifically have addressed some of that in some of the proposals they made.
Well, I've heard Representative Jerry Madden, I've got 3 or 4 times, go through his scenario as what happened in Texas from meetings I've been that he was attending. And I say, well, gee, that seems like that's a good model for us to if not totally emulate, realizing every shoe is not going to fit every foot. But are we doing something in line with what was done, say, in Texas and Louisiana and South Carolina, or are we doing something as building our own special model?
I may not be the one that can answer that, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Willard, I can maybe shed a little bit of light on it in that, some of the language that's in this bill I know came at the suggestion of the administration, which I assume came at the suggestion of the Pew Center. That being said, I'm not absolutely positive of that, but that being said, I think to the extent that we can take that and simplify it, I think there are some areas in the bill that are needlessly complicated in terms of this degree, you know, first, second, third. We need to simplify that as best we can. This whole burglary issue is a great example. Dwelling, non-dwelling, and then get into repeat offenses and leave it at that, so it's a very clear understanding of what is and what is not, you know, first-degree burglary or second-degree burglary. So we don't have, you know, kids prosecuted for stealing a tennis racket out of a shed for burglary. I mean, that's the example that comes to mind to me, just to be the most ridiculous example, but actually happens.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Neal.
Following up, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following up with Representative Willard, one thing I would love for us to do is try to get Representative Madden here for our committee to spend a little bit of time with Representative Madden, if that would be possible, and I don't know if it would be or not, but Texas 6 or 7 years ago led the way with this and have had incredible results. And Senator Grant and I had an opportunity to go to a conference and see what Texas had done in a couple of other states, and we came back from that conference committed to working toward criminal justice reform. We reached out to the Pew Center and asked them to help facilitate that for us, and as a matter of fact, the governor, speaker, lieutenant governor, I think the chief sent letters to Pew and asked them to come and facilitate, and what they did was came and had conversations with us where Mr. Spear with Applied Research crunched some numbers, looked at Georgia drivers, and the council recommendations, from my understanding, came specifically from what the council wanted to do based on the drivers that we were seeing on Georgia numbers, with in the background the evidence-based practices that have been done in other states. And I think that's a great approach. Is when you see the needs that you have within your state, you see the drivers within your state, and you can identify in other areas, other states, things that have effectively impacted those areas that you're dealing with in your own state, to put together a report like the council did, and I think the council did a great job. Judge Markle led that council, and I think there were 13 altogether. Mr. McDade and Senator Hamrick, and did a great job looking at the prison drivers of Georgia, and I think they brought us a great document to work to begin with, and I commend the council for that work.
Mr. Malden or Mr. Olson, did you have anything you wanted to add? I want to give you every opportunity.
Mr. Chairman, if I could,
sure.
Again, I'm Ken Malden. I'm cover Clark and Coney County. But I want to address just the drug court that was discussed earlier and tell you a little bit about what we do in Athens, because it's a little bit different than what the great courts that Judge Boggs and Judge Bagley have, and Judge Weaver and everything else. So there is some divergence about how that's handled across the state. We do primarily a pre-adjudication as well. When that first got started, actually, Judge Jones is now on the federal bench. We started that in 2004. The discussion was just to really deal with first-time offenders, and just the carrot at the end of completion was dismissal. And I remember suggesting at that time we ought to try to capture some other folks who may be the abusers, who may have had some other priors. And to that extent, they come in pre-adjudication and they plead guilty as well prior to any sentence and all. Upon our recommendation, and what happens if they successfully complete, we've agreed up front that they're going to get a reduced sentence. So instead of them going to jail for 2 years, they may get 120 days in the detention center or whatever have you, perhaps up front. And if they successfully complete it, then they'll get that reduced sentence. If not, it becomes a blind plea. So we deal with it a little bit differently. Pre-adjudication, we have those offenders that we agree to dismiss up front as kind of the gatekeeper. And we also have those offenders that we've agreed to reduce sentence if they successfully complete. I'm pointing that out to tell you that we do it somewhat differently than other ways. And some other portions of the state, they may do it different as well, just to let you know. And we hear a good bit of the time where the defense lawyer, public defenders, primarily, some of them in particular, they don't want to put somebody in drug court because it is onerous. They just refuse to do that, even though we're recommending they go in there and to do that. I don't know whether there's a way to craft something where they would basically, you know, it's not going to be any better if they don't go in, you know. It's not going to be any worse if they go into drug. Is there some sort of way to make sure, listen, you know, you're going to get the same thing if you're sentenced as it will if you go into drug court. To make
we
it
wouldn't want
worth
to
their
mandate.
while to go.
We wouldn't want to mandate that, though.
Well, I don't know whether they'd mandate it. They'd have to voluntarily go in. If, in fact, they were sentenced, if they were going to get some sort of sentence, you know, of treatment and everything else, and they're going to wind up having to go through a good bit anyway, then they may feel they need to go into drug court. They might as well go into drug court because they're going to get pretty much the same sort of conditions. They're not mandated to go in. I'm not suggesting
Okay,
that
I'm
at all.
sorry.
I don't know how to craft that. But to encourage more addicts to be able to go in would be a great way to do that. In addition, I think it is real important that you have that separation of responsibility that was discussed earlier, where the prosecution really kind of serves as that gatekeeper. What my assistants do is they actually go in once a week. The ADA who's in charge of that goes and meets with the police department, the drug task force, and basically looks at the cases once they've kind of culled them out and looked at them. These are potential candidates, and they run that by them to really see, is this somebody that needs to be in drug court? And that's real effective because they know this person may only have possession, you know, at this point, but they may be a drug dealer. You don't want the drug dealers in with your community of drug court participants. And so that intelligence is something I think is really important. And they kind of bring that back, and that's why it's important, I think, for us to kind of serve as that gatekeeper, because we can basically try to develop that sort of intelligence and bring that back and decide whether to have the person go in or not as we kind of go through that.
Mr. Willard.
I like that. What would you need, though, as far as tools to do your work on that gatekeeper role? Because this bill talks about there being some type of assessment model that we want to adopt. Do we have those now?
That might be one. Some of the folks that may be conducting that assessment, though, of course, the assessment we know about are kind of more the clinical assessment, the assessments to decide about whether they are a real abuser or just an infrequent user. But what we get, I guess, in meeting with the department, it may not be something that risk assessment would come up with, but maybe it could. That this person really is a dealer, you know, somebody who is somebody high up. And we distinguish folks who may be selling to support a habit, and they do that in a, you know.
I guess what I'm looking at, Mr. Malden, we have numerous, of course, DAs, and I'm saying all DAs are good people, but I'm saying you have differing attitudes and maybe differing approaches on this gatekeeping role. You know, I'm trying to say we want to adopt a uniformity. Will we have something that each one would go by as a guidebook or program, say these are things we're looking for as a gatekeeper and making the recommendation to the court?
I'd have to think about that a little bit more. I don't know whether I have a specific answer to tell you exactly, you know, can you really have a guide? Because it really goes from circuit to circuit based on what their community is and what the resources are.
True.
I can tell you it works well for us.
Yeah.
And I had to talk to the drug task force about it. They were generally somewhat opposed to this when we got it started with Judge Jones. And Judge Stevens has taken it over, has done a wonderful job with it since Judge Jones left. But it's we talked with them about it, said, you understand, when they come in, they plead. They don't come in if they filed and gone through umpteen motions to suppress and everything else. You know, we're not going to let them in. You know, we're not going to go through all of that and then, you know, spend all that time and put them in. They come in and plead up front, whether it's a dismissal case or reduced sentence case. That plea is not withdrawable. If they successfully complete it, then they get whatever it is that we've agreed to do. If they do not complete it, then it's like a blind plea. And so they have a real carrot to complete that. I don't know what it would look like, but anything that would encourage more folks to get into it is better. But when I talk to the task force, it's like, you guys, you understand that you don't have to go through any motions. I mean, it's done. If they complete this requirement, it's pretty tough. 17 to 24 months. If you complete it, it's pretty good. And if they get it done, and then hopefully they get out of it successfully, then it's hopefully we're all better off for that. And they bought into it. They bought into it. We just want to make sure that we keep the dealers out of it, and that's where that intelligence comes in. And that's not something the judiciary folks can, that's not their role to go meet with the police department and find out who's a dealer and who's not a dealer. And then we bring it back if we authorize it, and then it gets into staffing, and the whole drug court team staffs it. And I did that for several years with the judge when it first got started, trying to make sure that happened.
Mr. Weldon.
I'll wait.
Okay. Mr. Neal.
Thank you. Thank you for what you're doing there. I have a little knowledge of your court there in Athens, Clarke County, and from what I hear, y'all are making an impact, and I appreciate that.
Don't leave out of Coney County now. Two different counties, but I represent both of them.
I did have a question. Some of them have dismissed, and some of them have reduced sentences. Mm-hmm. What's the difference?
Their record, primarily. If somebody's basically, it may be somebody that's on probation and they're coming up for revocation because of some new case that involves substance abuse. It could be another theft. It could be another drug charge or whatever. And if they went to trial and were convicted, they'd be looking at some, jail sentence. Mm-hmm. 2 years, 3 years. We're not going to get into the 10-year type folks and reduce those, but somebody that may be in the nature of about 2 years if they get revoked, it'd be that kind of person, And so basically, if they successfully complete it, we'll agree to come off the jail time, and usually it might be all the way, or it may be 120 days up front in the detention center to help kind of get them started, perhaps.
In the detention center?
Yeah,
okay.
As a condition of their, not their sentence, because they're not sentenced yet. But
okay.
At the end, they'd actually be sentenced. But I want to tell you, when you get to the end and they have a ceremony graduation, as you know, and it's a dismissal case, and sometimes if I get a chance to be there, I'll be there, and they successfully complete it instead of a dismissal case, when you basically hold up that, say, Judge, one other thing, I have this motion in all process, this case I'd like to go ahead and present to them at this time, so present to the court. It's a big deal.
Excellent. Let me ask you, and I'm not going to go long with this, Mr. Chairman, just real quick. When an offender completes your program, do you and I know once they complete the program, your ability to work with them is diminished, but is there any efforts on your part to make sure that they're encouraged to continue in aftercare, and do you try to have them plugged in somewhere by the time they complete the program where they're doing some aftercare? Or
there's not something I guess we do. I'm sure there's that opportunity for follow-up,
Yeah, I know it wouldn't come from your office, but
yeah,
from that treatment provider
I'm
part
sure
of it.
I can't really speak to that exactly, but I'm sure there is every opportunity. I'm sure they'd be more than welcome to have folks to continue to participate, but I'm not aware of anything that's kind of structured in that way.
Yeah, I'm not talking about continuing to participate with the court, but one of the things that's critical, and I think this is one of the key pieces in keeping those individuals from reoffending, is they've got to understand that they've got a disease that they've got to work the rest of their life to stay in recovery, and that means that they have to continue an aftercare program. And a successful drug court, to me, has to have that element to where part of what you impart in them while they're in the drug court is that they stay on that aftercare program. Do you have folks who've completed the program that sometimes comes back and shares with those that are in the program?
As far as I understand, yes, there
Excellent.
are some occasions where they do that. They've maintained contact with those individuals.
By the way, I am interested in and willing to travel the state to see drug courts and to speak. I am an advocate and will do anything I can to help our drug courts.
You may be the next graduation speaker. So.
I'll be honored to do that. Thank you.
That's a great idea.
Mr. Chairman,
yes,
I have two very brief issues to assist the committee
sure.
to address. One is I would encourage the committee, the chairman, to ask Ms. Mary Beth Westmoreland to participate in this process. I think she requires an invitation to participate. considering her situation. She's raised some issues with me that I think she's certainly a whole lot smarter than anybody at this table and could address those issues. But
It's a recurring theme today, isn't it?
I mean, can't argue with the truth. The other thing on a more on a serious note, in response to Chairman Willard's inquiry about whether or not this committee should set up standards by which it directs who can go in or who is eligible for a drug treatment program, I would tend to suggest that careful consideration ought to be given to Judge Bagley's assessment this morning that there is a separation of powers issue, and I don't believe respectfully that this body has the constitutional authority to direct that I give up my constitutional authority and decide what case is an appropriate case for a specific type of prosecution without forcing us to be participating in a process where we
Oh, I don't know. I tend to agree, and I
I may misquoted that was what you're understanding what I was saying. I was saying that I think there needs to be something done as standards out there that we don't set it up. But something be adopted as a sort of like a guidebook that is used as a means of saying these are the things we'll do as a part of the procedure for getting people qualified, because things do vary across the state. We know that in sentencing. We know that in everything we do.
That's best practices, really, is what I think is what I think I'm hearing, Mr. Chairman. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I'm a firm believer in leaving as much of the decision to the local processes as possible in each circuit with each judge and each court. But the constitutional issue is one I just think.
I think we're all cognizant of that. I mean, I understand you have to bring that up. I think we're cognizant of that. I think that's a perfect role for the Judicial Council. Potentially, I mean, in conjunction maybe with the DA's Association, to put together best practices if they haven't already done so. I mean, we can look at that in terms. I'm hesitant about. I think we're hesitant in general about mandating too much about, and we want to maintain that flexibility, because where you've got that local flexibility, you've got effectiveness and efficiency, and that's part of the balance we're trying to strike here. So, best practices, yes, but trying to mandate too much and too many restrictions, that really does chill innovation. And I mean, let's face it, in talking to Judge Weaver out in the hall earlier, I mean, these things evolve over time, and you learn by having situations occur, and peer review that we heard earlier, that's amongst people who are doing the deal themselves right then and there, and that includes the prosecutors. So I would think and hope that the Judicial Council at some point, when it does that, if it already hasn't, and it may, and I'm just not aware of it, I'm sure I would hope that they'd invest the prosecutors and the defense lawyers, frankly, about what's working and what's not. I think that's just intuitively common sense. So, gentlemen, we appreciate your being here this afternoon and offering your perspective. Your comment about Ms. Westmoreland from the AG's office. Ms. Westmoreland has been a tremendous asset and a resource to me, and has saved me on, I don't know how many occasions, and really rescued us from ourselves more than a few times. So that office in general is a tremendous help, and she is specifically, and I've told her that, but I keep on telling her that. She doesn't believe me, but I do. Chairman Hamrick.
I'd just like to say what I've learned since we're talking about separation of powers, what I think it means. I think it means that each branch should do what the other branch tells them to do.
That I sense a local issue here, which for those of us who've been here a while, we see a local issue, we just start stepping back. We leave the room immediately. But gentlemen, thank you very much. Mr. Spahas, I'd intended to go ahead and call upon you. We're going to end at 3 o'clock, and it's 5:03 now. I do not want to give anyone short shrift. Does your schedule allow you to be here tomorrow morning? Yes. Will that work for you? Yes. Okay, then you'll be first out of the gate tomorrow morning. I know we'll hear from Mr. Spahas. We'll hear from the Georgia Retail Association, as well as our friends in the Defense Bar, and get through as many as we can with the target of going from 9 to noon tomorrow, and with respect to people who have to get out of town before traffic kicks in. And I've learned a lot today. I hope the members have too. and we'll march on from there tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. We're adjourned.